The next few murals depicted the battles between the 6 radiant figures and the vague shapes hiding in the darkness of the abyssal void. Sunny found them quite funny. He already knew that the war between the gods and the unknown were waged with weapons like death, time, and space. It had truly been a war beyond human comprehension. However, the ancient people had drawn the murals according to their human imagination. In them, the gods battled the void creatures with swords, spears, and even fists from time to time. Imagining a god having a fistfight with a primordial horror was rather comical. Sunny shook his head. It's curious, isn't it? The gods are always said to be the enemies of the void creatures, but really, they're void creatures themselves, just of a different breed. Both the unknown and the gods had been born from the void, so the gods were unknown themselves. Primordial beings from before anything remotely human had ever existed. It was just that they were a very special kind of these ancient abominations, a kind that was inherently opposed to the abyss that had spawned them, and everything it represented. Nephis slowly nodded. Indeed, but does it matter? Sunny lightly shook his head and admitted that he supposed it didn't matter. Awakened and nightmare creatures were also 2 sides of the same coin. That didn't make them the same. The 3 of them continued forward, studying the murals. Eventually, the void creatures seemed to have been defeated, albeit not destroyed, beaten and diminished. They crouched in a dark corner of the abyss, surrounded by the 6 radiant figures, and Sunny remarked that it was interesting. Sunny knew very little about how the war between the gods and the unknown had ended. The description of the drop of ichor only said that the void had been bound, but not how it had happened. Finally, the 3 of them stopped in front of the second-to-last mural. On it, the 6 radiant figures seemed to be holding a net made from what was left of the golden flame, surrounded by a whirlwind of sparks. They threw the net on the crouching creatures of the void, engulfing them in radiance. The last mural depicted a familiar landscape. The black abyss was gone, replaced by forests, plains, rivers, and a vast blue sky. He looked at Cassie expectantly. She had been the one to spend a whole year with the inhabitants of the nightmare, after all. If anyone knew their myths, it would be her. The blind girl sighed. In the end, when the old ones were defeated, the gods took direction and used their weapons to wrap it around the void. That was how the void was sealed. And that was also how the world was created. Sunny stared at the last mural, overcome by an eerie feeling, and asked everyone to wait a second. The forests, plains, rivers, and a vast blue sky. The crouching beings enveloped by a net of golden radiance. He already knew that these murals had been drawn according to the limited imagination of their creators. So, if he looked beyond what was drawn, at the underlying meaning, desire, direction, order, the absolute laws like time and space that the gods had created to use as weapons, did it mean that the gods had created the world, the universe, rather, by sealing the void in the cage of universal laws? And if this was how the world had been born? He shivered. So, wait, does it mean that everything we know is basically a cage for the abyssal beings of the void? That everything is just the outer shell of a prison built to contain the abyss? Cassie and Nephis turned to him somberly. After a while, the blind girl said, her voice strangely calm, I think not quite that literally, but yes, the void was never destroyed, it was only bound, and the world is what binds it, not the waking world, and not the dream realm, more of existence itself. As we know it, Sunny remained silent for a while, not knowing what to say. What Cassie said sounded terrifying. It was as though he was standing on the surface of a deep, dark ocean, separated from its lightless depths only by a thin, fragile film of ice. That ice was all of existence, and Sunny whispered a curse of damnation. Why was he so bothered by some stupid myth, anyway? The answer was obvious. It would have been easy to dismiss the whole thing as an ancient superstition if not for one detail. The The spell had put the same story in the description of the drop of Shadow God's blood, which meant that there was at least some truth to this myth, no matter how distorted, and he cursed, eventually. He let out a shaky breath and said in an unconvincingly carefree tone, "Well, that's a bit disturbing, isn't it?" Indeed, it was. Much more than that, however. It raised so many questions. Was his interpretation of the myth close to truth? How had Weaver entered the void if it was sealed by existence itself? What had the demon of fate witnessed there? Exactly. Come to think of it, the creation myth explained a lot of things, but one thing it failed to explain were the demons. Where had they come from? Who was the unknown, whose children they supposedly were? How were the demons and their progenitor connected to the gods and to the void? There were much more fundamental questions, as well. For example, the path of ascension led to divinity, while the path of corruption was opposed to it, leading to unholiness. And since what opposed the gods was the void, was the true meaning of profane and unholy, as used by the spell, actually having to do with the void? Was the abyss sealed within the world the source of corruption? Was the vile darkness permeating the souls of nightmare creature a manifestation of the everlasting void? And how did the nightmares, the spell, and Weaver's mysterious schemes fit into all of this? Sonny suddenly shuddered as a certain thought entered his mind. Now that the gods were dead, was the spreading corruption a sign that the seals containing the void were weakening? Was the cage the gods had created slowly falling apart? The disturbing chill he had felt after learning the truth of the last mural was washed away by curiosity. But now, the feeling of dread was back. He hesitated for a few moments, then cleared his throat and looked away from the ancient, damaged, fading image of forests, rivers, and plains. The net of black cracks covering the painted vastness of a blue sky didn't look ominous at all. Let's go find that damned library and get the hell away from here as fast as possible, shall we? This place, it seriously gives me creeps. For once in his life, Sonny hoped to never find answers to the questions gnawing at his mind. If you know someone who would enjoy unraveling these mysteries, pass this episode along to them. As they moved deeper and deeper into the flooded temple, Sonny couldn't help but think about the eerie story told by the ancient murals. It seemed as though he had learned something important. But of course, there were a dozen questions for every answer he had received. Like always, knowing that the very fabric of the world was like a cage for the abyssal void that dwelled beneath made him feel uneasy. Understandably so. However, Sonny didn't dwell on that fact for too long. There was no point. Anyway, matters like these were too distant and inconceivable for a mere mortal to think about, even if the seals created by the gods were slowly crumbling. What was a human like him supposed to do? Even if Sonny was a sovereign, he would have been like an ant compared to the powers involved in this process. The seals had existed for eons. Anyway, despite their supposed weakened state, they would keep existing for just as long. By the time the void broke free of its prison and destroyed everything, he would be long dead, with not even dust left of his bones. And he mused on the nature of the divine and the unholy, probably. In any case, he was more interested in something else, the true source of the corruption. Sonny had a vague suspicion that it was the void before, but now he was almost certain, and he wondered how it worked. The timeline of the Dream Realm civilizations wasn't very clear, but one thing he did know was that the corrupted, the nightmare creatures, had always existed, even when the seals of the void were new and pristine. The first era Sonny knew of was the era of the void. He decided to call it the Age of Chaos. During the Age of Chaos, the gods had been born, waged war against the elder abyssal beings, and eventually defeated them, thus creating the world. What followed was the Age of Heroes. Noctis and the other chain lords had been born during that period. Back then, At the dawn of time, humans weren't a dominant force in the world yet. Their nascent civilization was growing and spreading. But the continuation of its existence wasn't at all guaranteed. Instead, those ancient humans had to fight against the corrupted to conquer new lands, protect their cities, and avoid extinction. They needed powerful champions to battle the dreadful beings who populated the young world, and therefore that time was remembered as the Age of Heroes. More importantly, the nightmare creatures already existed back then, when the gods were alive and the seals of the void were undamaged. How?
I guess the gods didn't imprison all of the void and every void being when creating the prison.
It was easy to imagine that some remnants of the abyss slipped through their fingers and came to exist in the newly created world. Noctis had told him once that the gods and the demons fought side by side as allies in the battles of the ancient past. Therefore, it was easy to conclude that the war against the abyss didn't end as soon as the abyss itself was sealed. There had to have been dire battles at the dawn of the new world, resulting in these abyssal remnants being exterminated. Come to think of it, Nephis had told him that a terrible creature was slain by the gods once, at the dawn of time, and that its blood seeped into the ground, becoming true darkness. The place where the creature fell was now known as the Hollow Mountains, beneath which lay the darkness of the underworld. That creature had to have been a void being. That proved that at least some of them had walked the world of the gods after its creation. What are void beings, though? Sunny felt as though he was on the precipice of an important discovery. The gods. He had thought once that they were simply divine titans. Now, however, Sunny was inclined to believe that the gods were beyond ranks and classes altogether. Similarly, void creatures wouldn't have been unholy titans. Just like the gods, they had to have been creatures of an entirely different order. More importantly, they were simply different. These abyssal horrors were beings from before time, space, death, and every other law that comprised the fabric of reality. These existences were completely alien to the reality familiar to Sunny, opposed to it, even. And if Sunny knew one thing about creatures of great power, it was that they exerted influence on the world. Saints and powerful masters had a mystical presence to them. Nightmare creatures of higher classes spread their influence across vast territories. Sovereigns ruled over grand domains. Void beings were without a doubt immensely powerful. So what kind of influence would they exert on a world that was inherently alien to their nature? Would the fabric of reality and the very laws comprising it start to rot and come undone around them? Sunny felt his heart skipping a beat. Was that the true nature of the corruption? Was it a rot caused by the influence of the primordial void, simply because of its alien nature? That would explain why the creatures infected by that rot possessed an insatiable desire to destroy those who weren't. Why they all seemed mad, revolting, and alien, appallingly wrong in some strange and sinister way. The divine and the unholy were inherently opposed to each other. After all, it was in their very nature to strive to obliterate each other.
I feel like I am not far from the truth.
Sunny remained silent for a while, walking behind Cassie with a distant expression on his face. The world he lived in, the world of the spell, the constant battle against the abominations, and the ruined realm of dreams and nightmares, suddenly made much more sense. It was an understanding. Exactly. The conclusions Sunny made were too vast and had too many consequences to be understood in just a few minutes. But the feeling of it all was somehow more clear now. He lingered for a bit, then threw a furtive glance at Nephis and asked what that meant for her, her ascended ability. Longing made her immune to the corruption. Knowing what he knew now, that seemingly weak ability seemed even more impossible. More than that, one of her attributes was called Nephilim. Its description read, "There once were terrible creatures born of an unholy union between the divine and the profane. Nephilim were the most beautiful and the most harrowing of them all." If the divine and the unholy were inherently opposed to each other, then how could there have been creatures born from their union? How terrible had they been, really, and what had happened to them? Shaking his head slightly, Sonny sighed and looked away from Neph's slender figure.
I take it back, nothing makes sense. I am just confused even more.
Taking a step forward, he suppressed a groan and covered his face with a palm. Sonny continued to think about the history of the dream realm. The Age of Chaos was the first, ending with the imprisonment of the void and the creation of the world. It was followed by an age that could be called the Age of Gods, a prehistoric time when the gods and those living things they created, as well as the demons who came out of nowhere, battled the remnant abyssal creatures across the newborn world. Then came the Age of Heroes. It started when the nascent humanity started to spread and fight against the corrupted creatures inhabiting the world for dominion over it. It ended when the abominations were pushed back and largely exterminated, turning from an ever-present danger into dire, but rare foes. What followed was a different age, an age when humanity ruled the world unopposed. Noctis hadn't known its name, perhaps because people living in that time needed none. For them, it was simply now. A golden age of peace and prosperity.
Relatively speaking, of course, I am sure there was plenty of bloodshed and conflict even after most of the corrupted had already been slain or driven into the wilderness. Humans are humans, after all. There were other tribes of creatures inhabiting the world, as well. I doubt that everyone lived together in absolute harmony.
Due to their immortality, Noctis and the other chain lords, powerful transcendent born in the Age of Heroes, lived long enough to witness the new age. As well, in fact, they might have had more to do with the change of epochs than anyone knew. Noctis considered the destruction of the Kingdom of Hope to be the turning point in history, one that signified the end of the Age of Heroes, which meant that the Golden Age was poisoned from the very start. It began with the imprisonment of Hope, and ended when she broke free from her chains. During that time, the gods grew distant and indifferent. Their followers even started to fight among themselves. Slowly, prosperity waned, turning into stagnation and decay. Both the first and second of Sonny's nightmares took place at the dusk of the Golden Age, not long before the demons rose in rebellion against the gods. That war, the last war, destroyed the civilization of the dream realm. Although it was like a flash in the scope of history, perhaps its brief terror was worthy of being considered an age of its own, the Age of Demons, a terrible age of dread and destruction. Although that age was the latest, it was also the most mysterious. Everything the humans of the waking world had found in the dream realm were marks left by the great war between the demons and the gods, and yet, almost nothing was known about it. Why did it start? How did it end? How did the gods die? What happened to their enemies, the demons? All that Sonny knew was that at some point between the start of the Doom War and the present day, the seeds of nightmares appeared, and the corruption reclaimed the world it had been almost banished from once. It was the end of the dream realm.
Come to think of it, I am wrong.
The history of the dream realm had never really ended. There were human settlements on its perilous reaches today. After all, great citadels like Bastion and Ravenheart, and many smaller ones, where hundreds of thousands of awakened lived, fought, and survived, slowly claiming more and more land from the nightmare creatures.
Almost like a new age of heroes.
Or rather, the age of the nightmare spell. Sonny dodged a drop of water that fell from the ceiling of the narrow corridor and tilted his head a little.
Viewed from this perspective, it almost seemed as if the purpose of the nightmare spell was to repopulate the dream realm, which had been turned to lifeless hell by the Doom War, and breathe new life into it, to push the wheels of history that had stopped spinning a long time ago and make them revolve again, carrying the once desolate world into the future. It's almost like Weaver is some kind of a noble hero.
Of course, that change had come at the expense of countless deaths and immeasurable misery among the inhabitants of the waking world, and Sonny didn't really buy that the demon of fate had been any kind of hero, let alone a noble one. Still, the implication seemed too sensible to be discarded completely. the age of chaos, the age of gods, the age of heroes, the golden age, the age of demons, and the age of the nightmare spell. If seen in such a framework, the history could make Sunny a huge amount of contribution points. Just imagining it made his eyes gleam.
If I manage to write up this theory well and publish it, accurate or not, my, oh my, I'll be swimming in academic achievements, let alone a guest lecturer. I'll be made an honorary professor, a dean even.
As he grinned greedily, Cassie slowed her steps a little and raised her hand.
We're close. Be cautious. If there are really records left, we should be careful not to damage them any further.
Although the corridors they had walked through were largely flooded, this section of the lost temple seemed strangely dry. Perhaps the structure here was much more durable, and had thus resisted the passage of time better. Perhaps there were still some enchantments protecting the inner sanctum. In any case, the floor they walked on gradually became drier. Soon, the three masters passed a chamber filled to the brim with shelves. There had been countless books on them once, but now the shelves lay broken, the ancient scrolls long destroyed by water. Sunny checked a few, only to shake his head in disappointment. Even those that seemed relatively better preserved were utterly illegible. They moved further, passing several similar chambers. The library of the temple had indeed been vast once, but now, all the knowledge accumulated by the Sibyls and their faithful priests was lost. Some of it was destroyed by moisture, some seemed to have been burned, while some had been obliterated by the defiled Sibyl in her rage. Such a shame. Finally, they reached a tall door, just like all the other doors in the inner sanctum. It had long been turned to rotten splinters. However, the chamber behind it, the largest one they've seen in the last few minutes, looked strangely untouched. Much more importantly, there were no broken shelves and rotten scrolls within it. Instead, there were stone slates. After entering the central chamber of the ancient library, Sunny felt his excitement diminish somewhat. The stone slates had seemed unharmed from the outside, but at a closer look, they weren't in the best state. The defiled Sibyl had rampaged in this chamber. As well, many slates were shattered, some turned to rubble, others to dust. The whole place was a mess, with deep cracks littering its walls and the ceiling. There were deep puddles on the floor, and the cold darkness shrouding the chamber echoed with the sound of falling water. Still, there were many slates that were unharmed. As well, Cassie remained motionless for a few moments, then sighed and sat down on a relatively dry pile of rubble. Sunny gave her a stare. "I am looking."
And what, you're not going to help us look?
He coughed and awkwardly turned away.
Yeah, way to go, genius, asking a blind person if she'll look.
Although Cassie's awakened ability allowed her to navigate the world, it didn't grant her sight. Cassie sensed the future as if she lived it, meaning that she remained blind. It was her ascended ability that allowed her to see, even if it was only through someone else's eyes, someone like Sunny or Nephis, for example, which meant that she could only look at the slates that they were looking at. So, she could only help them identify the correct one, not find it herself. Hiding his embarrassment, Sunny cleared his throat.
So, what exactly should we search for?
Cassie lingered for a moment. We should probably separate all the intact slates first. Even those that don't contain the information we're currently looking for might be useful later.
Indeed, rescuing Effie and Jet wasn't going to be their last stop on the Great River. They would have to travel to Twilight as well, and then journey all the way to the dawn of time to attack Verge. There was no telling what kind of dangers hid beneath the surface of the endless river. Even though the information recorded by the Sibyls was outdated by now, it was still immensely valuable. Cassie tilted her head a little.
Other than that, keep an eye out for any mention of flowers.
Sunny nodded. There wasn't much known about the place where Effie and Jet were trapped, but the inhabitants of Fallen Grace referred to it as the Wind Flower. The vague stories they had heard about that area of the Great River told very little, except for how no one ever returned from there. It wasn't even known where the name Windflower had come from. With a sigh, Sunny nodded and went about sifting through the rubble without wasting much time. Soon, He and Nephis were crawling through the debris, separating those slates that were only lightly damaged from those that were completely destroyed. As they did, Sunny briefly looked at each one, although Anank had taught them how to navigate the Great River, at least enough for them to make their way to Fallen Grace. He couldn't really read the maps engraved into the slates. The maps Sunny was used to were based on topography and landmarks like mountains, rivers, and craters. What was there to put on a map of an endless, vast river? The system the Sybils had used was rather elaborate. It was based on a convoluted method of assigning each slate a kind of coordinates that had to do with its relation to the edges of the Great River, the passage of the suns, and the approximate distance to the few stationary hazards plaguing the tomb of Ariel. None of the slates depicted the full map of the Great River, either. Instead, they were supposed to be put together and moved around as the areas described on them shifted their locations, with old coordinates being stricken from the slate and new ones added, since most of the slates had been destroyed. There was no hope of recreating the full map. However, one great thing that the Sybils and their servants had done was including a description of what was depicted on the slates, engraved on the back. So, instead of trying to decipher the markings describing the coordinates, Sunny read these descriptions instead. His face slowly grew gloomy.
A giant maw that opens underwater and swallows entire island ships. A region where the wind literally cuts flesh. What the hell? An illusory island that can only be seen by the dying.
So what? If he suddenly saw that island, it would mean that he was going to die in the next few minutes. Or was it the other way around, and it was seeing the island that killed people? In any way, it was very much way too creepy. Sunny knew that the tomb of Ariel was a dreadful place, but now, he suddenly felt lucky to have made it to Fallen Grace in one piece. Well, they had encountered the time storm, which was pretty terrifying even as far as the local perils were concerned. So, calling himself lucky might haven't been quite correct. Whatever. After a while, the two of them settled into a rhythm. Sunny was looking for those slates that were in one piece, while Nephis collected those that had been broken into pieces but could be restored, and put them back together with the help of the Dark Shaper. Cassie, meanwhile, rested on the pile of rubble for a while, then got bored and stood up to take a walk around the chamber. She hovered near them for a bit, then put her hand on the wall and slowly traced the perimeter of the chamber with her fingers, since there was rubble everywhere. It took her a long time to complete the circle and get back to the entrance. Actually, hadn't she been gone for too long? Suddenly worried, Sunny pulled his attention away from the slates and concentrated on his shadow sense. It only took him a split second. To his relief, he could still clearly feel Cassie's shadow. Turning around, he looked at the far end of the chamber and saw her delicate figure there. Standing in front of the cracked wall, she seemed deep in thought, frowning slightly. Sunny called out to her.
Is that wall very interesting? Come here and keep us company.
Perhaps it was foolish, considering that Cassie could sense the future, but Sunny wasn't absolutely sure that the flooded temple was safe now, and having the blind girl outside his immediate reach made him feel uncomfortable. What would happen if they were suddenly attacked? Hearing his voice, Cassie hesitated for a few moments, then turned to face them and pointed to the wall. Actually, it's interesting, she paused for a moment, and then added with uncertainty.
A slight wind is coming from the cracks. I think there's another room behind that wall.
Standing up, Sunny stretched and walked over to where Cassie was standing, extending his shadow sense through the cracked wall. He remained silent for a few moments, then smiled.
Good catch, there's indeed a hidden space there.
To think that he had almost missed it. The blind girl stared at him for a bit, which gave Sunny a hint to look around.
It's still creepy to know that she's riding my senses, can't she ask, at least? That ability of hers isn't limited to sight, so I don't even want to think what kinds of things she can sense me sensing.
Suddenly feeling hot, Sunny glanced at Cassie and asked in a stifled tone, "What are you looking for?"
The blind girl lingered. If there's a secret space, there has to be a mechanism to unlock it, some kind of lever, perhaps, and give me some credit. All right. I am polite enough to know when not to use my ability.
He suppressed an impulse to jump back.
What, you can read thoughts now, too?
Cassie took a deep breath, then patiently shook her head.
No, it was just written all over your face.
Sunny let out a sigh of relief, then trembled.
She's looking through my eyes, so how can she see my face?
At that moment, Nephis patted him on the shoulder.
Because she looked through mine. Honestly, Sunny, for someone who claims to have never used his shadow to do perverted things at the academy dormitory. You sure think of weird stuff often.
He stared at her in disbelief.
Claims to, I absolutely didn't. You know I can't lie.
Nephis looked at Cassie with a hint of a smile on her lips.
Notice that he said didn't instead of haven't.
Sunny remained silent, his mouth open, until he finally realized what was happening. Sunny remained silent, his mouth open. Scoffing, he turned away.
Yeah, and until I say won't, you better behave. Who knows what weird stuff I'll think of.
There were a few moments of silence, and then Nephis said a bit awkwardly from behind him.
So, whatever mechanism there was to unlock the door, it has to have broken a long time ago.
He grinned and watched as she stepped forward and delivered a swift punch to the cracked wall. The ancient stone shattered and collapsed, revealing a dark space beyond. Sunny shielded his face from the cloud of stone dust and peered inside. Hidden behind a false wall was a small circular chamber. There was an altar in its center with something laying on it as Nephis raised her torch. Its light reflected from a polished metal surface. He suddenly felt the shadows shift slightly and widened his eyes in disbelief as he stared at the strange glow. There was a staff of pristine white wood laying on the altar, untouched by dust or dirt. Both its ends were encased in a beautiful weave of bands of polished gold, with a single radiant gem, a crystal, crowning the top. The rough crystal was easy to identify as a soul shard of a rather high rank. Supreme, perhaps, or even higher. What made Sunny instinctively hold his breath, however, was something else. The white staff was emanating an ethereal golden glow, the kind that Sunny could only see because his eyes had been altered by Weaver's lineage, the familiar and unmistakable shine that the things having to do with divinity possessed. As he was looking at the beautiful staff, stunned, Cassie approached the altar and lowered her head. Her expression was more perplexed than shocked. She remained silent for a few moments, then said quietly,
How curious, I didn't know that it was here.
Both Sunny and Nephis looked at her with surprise. Throwing another glance at the staff, he asked if she knew what the thing was. The blind girl lingered for a bit, then nodded.
Yes, I think I do. It fits the description of one of the holy relics that the Sibyls brought into the tomb of Ariel from the outside world. Supposedly, it was a gift from one of the guards, bestowed to a priestess of their temple in the distant past.
Sunny's eyes widened.
Are you telling me that this thing is a divine artifact?
His heart was beating wildly. Cassie smiled.
Yes, in a sense, meaning that it's rumored to have been created by a god. However, it's not a divine rank artifact, if that's what you're asking, although it does have some mystical qualities. Its power is actually not that great.
She remained silent for a bit, and then added,
Actually, that can be said about most divine relics, and therefore about most divine memories created in their image. Not that there's many of those around. We humans perceive memories as something that grants us power, but for the gods and the lesser deities, they themselves were the power, so any relic they created would have been a mere tool of convenience, not something meant to empower them.
Sunny thought about his own two divine memories. That description fit them perfectly. Both Weaver's mask and the shadow lantern allowed him to do astonishing things, and yet, there were indeed memories in his arsenal that empowered him much more. There was no doubt that his divine memories were infinitely more powerful, and yet, they didn't make him much more powerful. He had considered this paradoxical situation plenty of times. And the conclusions he made were similar to what Cassie said. The gods didn't need external sources of power, and so, the tools they left behind served specific purposes, astonishing and wondrous, but not necessarily helpful to a human. The blind girl, meanwhile, gently caressed the white wood of the beautiful staff and added,
In any case, this relic is called Guiding Light. It's not even a tool made to be used by a guard, just something gifted to a mortal out of affection. The powers it possesses aren't that stunning. It had served the Sibyls well before they came to the tomb of Ariel, but after that, this staff mostly held symbolic meaning.
Sunny stared at the beautiful golden glow for a while, then asked in a dubious tone,
That's stunning, so what does it do?
Cassie thought for a bit, then hesitantly shrugged.
It's supposed to guide people. Actually, I don't know that well.
She picked up the staff and held it carefully. After a few moments, the soft radiance of the soul shard crowning the relic swirled, growing more intense on one side. Sunny blinked. What did you do? The blind girl suddenly seemed a little embarrassed. I guess so.
I just sort of thought in my head, Miss Guiding Light, can you guide me to Windflower, please?
He stared at her incredulously.
Let's skip the first part for now. So this divine relic is basically a pretty flashlight with a very basic navigation function.
Cassie coughed. Sunny sighed, then shook his head and covered his face with a palm, disappointed that he had gotten so excited. Well, it could have been worse. The previous divine relic he had found in the wild was a wooden knife that could only kill one specific person, while simultaneously being responsible for turning that person into an immortal powerhouse. Although the guiding light wasn't exactly an artifact worthy of being called divine, it was at least more useful than that. Actually, being able to know the general direction of almost anything you thought about was quite an amazing boon if used with foresight, not to mention that it would help them find the members of the cohort sooner, which was why they had come to this temple. In the first place, Sunny stared at the wooden staff for a few moments, then shook his head again.
Well, great, let's use this thing well. For now, though, we still have to find the information about Windflower.
They had already known where that place was located. What they had really come here to find was the information about what kind of dangers were waiting for them there. Turning away, Sunny let out a disappointed sigh and cursed under his breath as he walked back to the slates. He tried not to look too disheartened.
This had to be the most anticlimactic discovery of a divine relic ever.
Sunny had wanted to get back to the slates, but as he left the secret room, he suddenly felt uneasy. Something about the chamber had changed. He couldn't quite put a finger on it, but it was as if the shadows populating it were moving. Hearing Cassie's voice warn them to hold on to something, he put his hand on a stone pillar. In the next moment, the floor beneath him violently shook. Its already pronounced tilt was suddenly even steeper, causing countless small pieces of rubble to roll in their direction. The sound of falling water had grown louder. Curses. Looking at his companions, Sunny sighed and said in a glum tone,
I guess the battle did too much damage to the temple after all.
Nephis nodded somberly as Cassie asked whether they should hurry. He hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. A swarm of sparks rose into the air, slowly forming into a familiar alloy chest.
We probably don't have much time before this entire place sinks. Let's just load everything into the covetous coffer. We can continue studying the slates when we're safely back on the chain breaker.
Of course, safety was a relative term here in the tomb of Ariel. Sunny had only grown more wary of the great river after reading the records in this ancient chamber. But still, he wasn't enthused at the idea of having to escape the temple while it was actively drowning, feeling like they had very little time left. The three masters abandoned all attempts of categorizing the slates and simply threw everything remotely intact into the welcoming maw of the covetous coffer. The temple shook one more while they were at it, causing Sunny to curse in frustration. Finally, they were done, not wasting any time. Sunny led the way out of the central chamber, past the rooms full of rotting scrolls, and into the cold darkness of the narrow corridors leading to the Great Hall. By then, it felt like they were climbing a steep hill. The stone floor was tilted downward, water rushing past their feet and drenching them from above. I don't like this. Logically, Sunny understood that he would be able to escape the drowning temple even if it collapsed and started sinking. Not only was he strong enough to break through the stone walls, he also possessed memories of the House of Night that allowed him to swim like a fish and breathe underwater. However, he still felt tense and claustrophobic, being caught under an immense mass of stone, with cold water rising higher and higher with each moment. Wasn't the most pleasant of feelings. The ancient temple was shaking and groaning, slowly crumbling around them.
I can just send one of the shadows ahead and get to the surface by using Shadow Step. I can take Nephis with me as well.
He glanced at Cassie, who was walking behind them while using the holy staff as a cane. After a short moment of hesitation, Sunny chose to keep all the shadows with him. Soon, they reached the Great Hall where the battle had taken place. Although not much time had passed, it was in far worse shape already. There were actual waterfalls flowing through wide cracks in the distant ceiling, and the dais where Cassie and the Sibyl had clashed was partially submerged underwater. His shadows, whom he had left there to stand guard, were silently watching the rising water until Sunny called out for Nightmare to come. In the blink of an eye, the black stallion was already at his side. Sunny lingered for a moment, then turned around and grabbed Cassie by her thin waist. "Excuse me." Effortlessly lifting the delicate girl, he placed her on the dark destrier's broad back and gave Nightmare a silent command to reach the surface as soon as possible. Before they left, he shouted a warning for her to hold on tight. Cassie remained motionless for a split second, then suddenly paled and grabbed onto the dreadful steed's mane tightly. She opened her mouth to say something, but a moment later, both of them were gone in a burst of wind. All that could be heard was the sound of adamantine hooves ringing on stone in the distance, and a short shriek, leaving Sunny to murmur to himself. No matter how fast Sunny and his shadows were, Nightmare was many times faster, and since one of those shadows had been accompanying the black stallion, the three of them, the shadow, and the blind seer, reached the surface much sooner than Sunny would have. By the time he and Nephis reached the edge of the dais, he could already see the crimson blaze of the twilight sky. Just at that moment, the temple shuddered in another violent quake. Grasping Neph's hand, Sunny pulled her into the dark embrace of shadows. A short instant later, they stepped on the ashen soil of the incinerated garden, bright sunlight briefly blinding both. When Sunny regained his vision, the first thing he saw was Cassie kneeling on the ground in front of Nightmare, her face of an unhealthy greenish color, taking a few deep breaths. The blind girl raised a trembling hand and pointed an accusing finger at him.
WW, warn me next time, damn it.
He grinned.
Point. Didn't you already know what I was going to do?
Sunny hurriedly helped her stand up, dodging the tip of the guiding light in the process.
Watch where you point this thing. In any case, there's no time to tarry. We might have escaped the temple, but this whole island is going to fall apart soon, so hurry up and run.
At that point, Nephis gave him a somber look and said, her voice flat.
I'll hurry and run as soon as you let go of my hand.
She lingered for a moment and then added evenly,
Or do you want me to carry you?
Sunny froze, then lowered his gaze and realized that he was, indeed, still holding Neph's hand. He blinked a couple of times, then looked up and gave her a smile.
Actually, yeah, I wouldn't mind being carried.
With that, Sunny let go and dashed toward the shore of the island ship. Soon, The graceful silhouette of the chain breaker appeared in front of them. He felt much too happy to see the ancient ship, and leaped onto its deck without wasting a single second. Just as he did, the drowning island resounded with a deafening crack and split apart. After the island broke apart, it didn't take a lot of time for the debris to disappear into the depths of the great river. Sunny, Nephis, and Cassie stood on the deck of the chain breaker, observing the death throes of this lost part of fallen grace in somber silence. The flowing water seethed and boiled, turning into white foam. The ashen remains of the dark garden were pulled down by the current and swallowed by the depths, in something that felt like too short of a time, though. The surface of the river became calm and clear once again, with not a sign of the massive island vessel left in sight. Sunny sighed softly. The destruction of the artificial island had been too depressing of a scene. It was like a metaphor of the futility of human existence. Countless river people had worked hard to create and maintain it, and even more spent their lives walking upon its ground. But now, it was gone, swallowed by the elements in mere minutes. With every trace of it erased from existence, Weave was going to be erased the same way before too long. The cities of the Sibyls had already disappeared. Only fallen grace remained, its fate all but decided. The tomb of Ariel had been home to a thriving civilization once. But now it was nothing but a nightmare. Sunny shook his head, suddenly grim. Would the cities of the waking world be gone one day, too? He hadn't even known that there was a world outside the endless sprawl of Northern Quadrant siege capital once. It was hard to imagine that a place so populous and boundless could cease to exist. But then again, the waking world was already a world of ruins. Plenty of thriving cities had been erased from its maps, most of them, even. Entire continents stood desolate, devoid of life, and uninhabited. He even witnessed the extinction of one of these empty continents himself.
My mood is all over the place today.
What was there to feel sad about? That island had been nothing by the lair of a dangerous abomination. They had come to its shore, killed the abomination, and absconded with precious loot. Cassie even received a pretty stick as a bonus. If anything, he should be feeling utterly delighted, however. Sunny felt mostly tired and sore all over. The battle against the drowned was a short one, but nevertheless very intense. He was battered and bruised, albeit not injured too badly. Sunny turned and glanced at Crow, who was hopping excitedly on the railing and staring at the empty space where the island had been with a curious expression while crowing that it was gone. The small bird was unburdened by any kind of heavy thoughts. In fact, it didn't have any thoughts at all. After all, it was an echo, now that the island was destroyed, though that echo had a job to do. As he watched, Cassie approached the black bird and gently took it into her hands, saying something. The blind girl opened her palms and let the crow fly away. The last thing they heard before Jet's echo disappeared into the distance were indignant caws complaining that it was stuck. Crow had a simple mission: to inform the inhabitants of fallen grace about the death of the defiled Sibyl, and then find its way back to the ship. The three masters didn't know how long it would take them to rescue Effie and Jet, so they wanted to make sure that the last city would migrate downstream in their absence. Hopefully, by the time they returned, the frail Riverborn would be doing much better. Sunny glanced at the wooden staff in Cassie's hands, then at the sails of the chain breaker. He observed that that was done, then hesitated for a moment and asked tiredly, "Should we set sail?" After a moment of silence, Nephis shook her head.
The night is approaching, and all of us are tired. I'd rather just drift with the current until tomorrow. A little rest won't do us any harm.
Sunny was happy to hear it. Soon, they were gathered on the mess deck at the stern of the ship. All its compartments had been cleared of debris and repaired by the inhabitants of fallen grace. But the three masters didn't visit most of them often, since there was no need to. They mostly spent their time on the upper deck, in their living quarters, or on the mess deck near the galley. There was freshly prepared food on the table, giving off the familiar, delicious smell of Neph's cooking. The covetous coffer stood with its lid open, its teeth gleaming in the warm light of a lantern. Sonny was cradling a cup of tea in his hands, glancing at the several slates laid down in front of him. Honestly, though, he was in no mood to study their mysteries. He just wanted to fill his belly and rest. With a sigh, he pushed the slates away and pulled his plate closer, swallowing the first mouthful of a fragrant meat porridge. Sonny closed his eyes in delight. Nephis was preoccupied with eating. As well, Cassie, though, seemed to have forgotten about it. She was playing with her new shiny toy instead. The soul shard at the tip of the holy staff was emanating light, its intensity changing from time to time. Sonny stared at her for a bit, then asked what she was doing. The blind girl took a sip of tea absent-mindedly.
Trying to figure out how it works. It's weird. The enchantment doesn't seem to respond to everything. It points to you, Nephis, Effie, and Kai, but not Jet or that person, Mordred, or Fallen Grace for that matter. It does respond to Wind Flower, though.
Sonny raised an eyebrow, then shifted his perception and gazed beneath the surface of the guiding light. Just as he had expected, there was no weave there. There were no runes either, just a field of blinding radiance. He had seen something similar when looking at the knives created by Sun God. Within each, there was nothing but a radiant ocean of something, soul essence, perhaps, and a soul string of fate bound onto itself and looping endlessly. Such was the sorcery of gods, entirely unreasonable and void of any kind of logic he could understand, looping endlessly. His tired mind got caught on these words, but he was distracted just then by Neph's strangely muffled voice, found it, shaking awake from his reverie. Sonny turned and looked at her. Nephis had a spoon in her mouth, holding one of the slates he had pushed away in both hands. Sonny was rather amused by that sight. She blinked a couple of times, then awkwardly removed the spoon from her mouth and pointed it at the slate while Sonny asked what she had found. Soon, all three of them were sitting side by side, with the slate resting on the table in front of them. Cassie was tracing her fingers across the stone surface, a focused look on her face as she described that it was Wind Flower. After a while, she slowly nodded.
The coordinates match. It's indeed the right place.
The blind girl was much more proficient in navigating the great river, considering how much longer she had spent here than Sonny and Nephis. She was also the one who had learned the transcript system of the Sibyls and pinned down where Effie and Jet were trapped. In the first place, Sonny looked at the slate. There were neat columns of symbols engraved on it, as well as an image of a messy circle with frayed edges. It resembled a vortex more than anything. Or maybe a cyclone. He turned the slate over, noting Wind Flower. Familiar runes covered its reverse side. Without wasting any time, the three masters read them. Pretty soon, Sonny's expression darkened.
The currents of the river are twisted and treacherous near Wind Flower. Strong gales violently assaulted our ship, as if trying to push it back. Desperate to escape our pursuers, we persisted, entering deeper into the mist. The surrounding waters moved in the wrong direction and with unnatural speed. It was as if we had lost our way and found ourselves near the edge. At some point, we weren't struggling against the repelling winds anymore. Instead, overcome by fear, we were battling the raging tide that pulled us deeper and deeper toward the source of the wind.
The first part of the text engraved into the reverse side of the slate was an excerpt from a report made by one of the outsiders who had lived in Fallen Grace. He ventured on a long journey with a small fleet, hoping to find out the fate of a different city, one of the last with which Fallen Grace still maintained a connection, until the visitors and merchant ship from that city had stopped coming. As well, the fleet managed to learn that the city had been destroyed. But on their way back, they were attacked by powerful defiled abominations. After a furious battle, only 3 ships managed to escape, pursued by the enemies. They were forced to enter the dangerous waters around Wind Flower.
For a few moments, the mist cleared, allowing me to glimpse the true nature of the tide. We were hopelessly caught inside a whirlpool of titanic proportions, which spun around a bottomless and dark abyss. There was an island hovering above the darkness, with a tall and magnificent tower rising above the misty cliffs. Terror grasped our hearts when we realized that the tide was pulling us into the darkness. Desperate to save our lives, we tried to escape.
In the end, only one of the 3 ships managed to fight its way out. The other 2 were swallowed by the vortex. Never to be seen again, Sunny remained silent for a few moments, then sighed and observed that it was a giant whirlpool. Something like that would explain how Effie and Jet had ended up stranded. If the vessel they were traveling on had been pulled into the monstrous vortex and destroyed, they would have no way of getting out again, or rather, no way of getting out again without some great luck. It seemed that they had reached the flying island at the center instead of being crushed in the depths. At least, the fact that Crow was around to deliver messages proved that. Cassie silently shook her head.
Not just a giant whirlpool, don't forget that the Great River is a river of time. Any anomaly of its current isn't a mundane one. There has to be something strange going on at Windflower as well.
Nephis nodded. Since none of them knew the answer, Nephis asked what it was and they turned back to the slate. The information they had recorded wasn't too helpful, though, due to the fact that almost no one returned from Windflower alive. That, however, was valuable knowledge in and of itself. The place called Windflower hadn't always been known by that name. Its previous one, however, was long lost. The magnificent tower the outsider from the Fallen Grace mentioned had been a stronghold of a powerful seeker once. There had been plenty of them throughout the tomb of Ariel before the foundation of Verge. It was unknown whether the seeker had left the citadel to challenge the estuary, still resided there, or perished a long time ago. All that the Sibyls of Fallen Grace knew was that, at some point, no one could approach the citadel anymore. There was only one exception that they had heard of. A familiar name, the Serpent King. It was rumored that the Serpent King, Daron of the Twilight Sea, had reached the stronghold and spent some time there, then returned to lead his people in the war against the defilement. Sunny stared at the runes with a thoughtful expression. They hadn't learned all the secrets of Windflower from the slate, exactly, but they had learned 2 crucial pieces of information. First, that it was possible to brave its danger and come back in one piece. The Serpent King had proved it. Second, he looked at Nephis, then at Cassie, and said,
At least we know the general nature of that place. Fighting against the whirlpool will be hard, but doable. The problem, though, is that the island is floating above its chasm, so if we don't want to be pulled into the depths and killed, the chain breaker has to be able to fly by the time we reach Windflower. Cassie, can you repair it in time?
The blind girl frowned and remained silent for a few long moments. Eventually, she slowly shook her head.
No, there's not enough time, nor is there enough resources to fully restore the enchantments of the ship by then.
As Sunny's expression grew somber, she hesitated a bit and added,
However, I think there's something I can do.
Cassie stood up and paced for about a minute, thinking about something furiously.
Yes, that can work too. I'll need to.
Finally, she stopped and spoke again.
I can't restore the connection between the sacred tree and the enchantment circle in time, but I can repair the circle itself, I think.
Nephis raised an eyebrow and asked what that would mean.
It means that the sorcery that allows the ship to fly will be fully functional. It's just that it wouldn't have a source of power, but we can use our own essence to fuel the enchantment. Limited as it's, the chain breaker won't stay in the air for long, nor will it be fast, but it'll carry us to that island and back.
She scratched her head awkwardly and then added in a small voice that it would probably work. Sunny stared at her for a while, then let out an amused chuckle. The odds, as always, were against them, but when had it been any different? He shrugged and decided that was good enough. The chain breaker had set sail once again. This time, they had to travel back to the middle area of the Great River where the sky was azure. They also had to travel some distance into the past, not enough to bring them anywhere near Verge, but deeper than any of the 3 had ever ventured. Sunny spent the first morning lazing in bed and staring at the ceiling. He was thinking about Windflower, the strong winds, the twisted currents. the colossal whirlpool that pulled ships to their doom, and the island flying above the dark abyss. All of it sounded rather nasty. There was the fact that the tower standing on the island had once belonged to a powerful seeker. As well, the seekers of truth were people who had entered the tomb of Ariel at the same time as the Sibyls, or even earlier than them, but for an entirely different reason. The seekers hadn't been searching for salvation from the devastation of the Doomsday War. Instead, they had braved the nightmare desert and found their way into the tomb built by the demon of dread due to their thirst for knowledge, out of curiosity. Basically, they hadn't been a unified group of people, either, but rather disparate individuals united only by the similarity of their obsession with knowledge, a bunch of weirdos who would climb into a dreadful tomb simply to satiate their curiosity. Sonny would never. Well, he had entered plenty of dangerous ruins to satiate his desire to explore the dream realm, but that was an entirely different matter. Firstly, he received contribution points for his exploits from time to time. Secondly, none of those ruins had been left behind by terrifying deities.
Come to think of it, a couple of them were.
Like the Ebony Tower, but he hadn't ended up there out of curiosity. He had ended up there out of greed. That was a much better reason, so he wasn't like those weird seekers at all. In any case, Sonny wasn't excited to visit the stronghold of a powerful seeker, not even considering the fact their desire to learn Ariel's truth had caused the birth of the defilement. These people didn't seem trustworthy at all. A hidden island where a mysterious seeker had lived before disappearing without a trace, surrounded by a nearly impassable barrier of water, wind, and twisted time. Yes, that didn't sound ominous at all, and Sonny muttered a curse at the thought. Of course, they didn't really have a choice. Effie and Jet were there, so Sonny, Nephis, and Cassie couldn't turn back. And Sonny reflected that people fear the unknown the most. If the slate had told them that there was a great nightmare creature living at Windflower, he would have been reluctantly, but calmly coming up with plans to defeat it. But it was the not knowing what waited for them at the center of the whirlpool that made Sonny feel nervous. In the end, tired of being anxious, he decided to distract himself by doing something useful, climbing out of his bed with a sigh. Sonny finally left his cabin and went to the upper deck. Saint, Fiend, and Nightmare were standing guard at the bow middle section, and the stern of the ship, Nephis was holding the steering oar, while Cassie was making preparations to repair the sorceress circle of the ship. Sonny hesitated for a few moments, then approached the blind girl.
Hey, can I take another look at the guiding light?
Looking up, Cassie smiled at him and pointed to the sacred tree. The beautiful staff stood there, propped against its trunk. Thanks, grabbing the sacred relic of the Sibyls. Sonny went to his usual spot in the shade of the ketch and sat down on the deck. Let's start, then. He spent some time weaving the basic enchantments around a transcendent soul shard. His goal was simple: to turn the guiding light into a memory, so that it was easier to use and could be taken back into the waking world after hours of focused work. However, Sonny was left staring at the wooden staff with a deadpan expression. His eye was twitching slightly. It was all a waste, the moment he tried to place the rudimentary weave inside the relic. The lightless strings of shadow essence dissolved in the blinding radiance hidden within the white wood. It was as if they were incinerated from simply touching divine sorcery, and Sonny cursed in frustration. All that work, for nothing, uttering a quiet curse. He stood up and put the guiding light back under the sacred tree, somewhat disheartened. Sonny went to switch with Nephis at the steering wheel. He guided the ship as she practiced with her sword, dancing with it as the seven suns slowly traveled across the crimson sky. He enjoyed the view a great deal. Later, Sonny spent some time staring at the estuary key, not at all closer to solving its many memories. He had a meal with Nephis and Cassie. He created more essence strings to replace the ones that had been destroyed, and practiced his own swordsmanship, mentally going over the battle with the drowned and thinking of what he could have done better. after all that. Sunny had to admit to himself that he was bored. It was a rather strange and luxurious feeling. Sunny had very rarely received an opportunity to feel bored, usually. There had always been something pressing for him to do, learn, or escape. It had been like that in the outskirts, and didn't change at all after the awakening. But here in the third nightmare, brief moments of intense and unreasonable danger were separated by long stretches of calm, of course. He knew that the calm wouldn't last long. It would take them some time to reach Windflower, but they would certainly have to fight for their lives many times on the way. The chain breaker would be attacked by nightmare creatures. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, or the day after that. There would be dangerous anomalies waiting for them under the waves. As well, perhaps some of those described on the stone slates. The Mad Prince could visit him in his dreams at any moment. The appearance of the other plagues weren't out of the question, either, but for now, at least, there seemed to be peace. So, Sunny decided to give himself a day off, for once, and enjoy that peace while it lasted, walking back to the stern of the ship. He summoned a certain piece of furniture and placed it a few meters away from Nephis, sitting down on his luxurious chair. He summoned the emerald flute and brought it to his lips. Nephis looked at him in confusion.
What are you doing? Trying to raise the dead, but there are no corpses on the ship.
Sunny blinked a couple of times, wondering who she took him for.
Is it so hard to imagine that I am just in the mood for music? Kai gave me a few lessons, so I can carry a tune. He might have begged me to perform as a guest during one of Night and Gale concerts, even.
She smiled faintly.
I noticed you said might have begged instead of begged.
Then, her eyes widened slightly.
Wait, Night and Gale concerts. Are they planning a reunion? When? Is it going to be old material, or has Gale written a new album? What about new choreography? Whose?
Sunny lowered the flute and stared at her sullenly.
Here she goes again, barraging me with questions. Yes, I don't know, probably not. No clues, no idea. I am not sure.
As the sky slowly grew brighter, the chain breaker sailed toward dawn. The three masters aboard the graceful vessel anxiously awaited the reunion with two lost members of their cohort.
I wonder.
Sunny stared at a delicious-looking golden fruit, torn between the desire to pluck it off the branch and the fear of tasting fruits from mysterious, mystical trees. The last time he had eaten one wasn't a memory he liked to remember. It probably tastes divine, though. In the end, he sighed and reluctantly looked away from the alluring fruit. It was better not to test fate. Sunny was currently high in the crown of the sacred tree, using it as a crow's nest. The sky above him was of a beautiful azure color, with not a hint of the deep scarlet splendor they had grown accustomed to in fallen grace. It had already been several weeks since they visited the lost library and slayed the defiled Sibyl. The 4th month of their nightmare had ended a few days ago. Of course, it had been much longer than that for Cassie and the other members of the cohort. Effie and Jet had spent more than a year stranded in the place called Windflower. By now, Sunny couldn't help but worry about them. He was also worried about Rain and the waking world, but there was nothing to be done about that. Climbing to a higher branch, he sighed and looked down. There was usually a black crow following him around, but today, the talkative bird was gone. It was somewhere ahead, scouting for prowling abominations and turbulent currents. The crow's presence meant that at least one of the two missing women was still alive. That made Sunny less anxious. In these past few weeks, the chain breaker had traveled far enough into the past to almost reach Windflower with the help of the guiding light. They didn't even have to waste time searching for its precise location. The sacred staff pointed directly to where they needed to go, so the dreadful whirlpool could appear from beyond the horizon any minute now. Of course, coming this far hadn't been easy. Sunny, Nephis, and Cassie had to fight for their lives on many occasions. The graceful vessel had been attacked by swarms of nightmare creatures, grotesque giants from the deep, aerial horrors, and even heralds of the defilement. That last battle had been especially dire. since the defiled were both sentient and vile, and yet the three of them had slain and slaughtered every enemy that dared to attack the chain breaker. For now, the ancient vessel withstood all the attacks without receiving serious damage as well, but the three masters weren't as lucky. Each of them had suffered many grave wounds, some of them almost fatal. If not for Neph's healing powers, they would have never made it so far. They wouldn't have made it without Cassie, either. Sunny had been reminded once more that traveling with an oracle was an invaluable boon. It was because of the blind girl that they had managed to avoid the true perils of the great river, the twisted currents and lethal aberrations where time itself would have killed them in the blink of an eye. They would have perished without Sunny and his shadows. As well, the third nightmare wasn't a place where one could survive without extreme battle power, and currently, he possessed the most of it out of them three, which made him ask if he wasn't great. Sunny smiled wryly, then shuddered and furtively looked around, checking to see if the sin of solace was near. The sword wraith wouldn't have missed a chance to cut him with a snide remark in response to such thoughts. But thankfully, the apparition hadn't deemed it necessary to climb the sacred tree with him. In fact, the sin of solace didn't seem to like being too close to the tree from the heart god's grove, for some reason. Sunny used that fact often to get some reprieve. He sighed. The journey to Windflower hadn't been easy, but at least they had all gotten something out of it. Nephis was one step closer to becoming a titan, and wore a chainmail shirt over her white tunic. Just like Anank's mantle, the new memory could be worn in conjunction with another armor, albeit due to its unique enchantment rather than its type, in a fashion strange for an awakened. She also carried her sword in a scabbard hung from her belt. The scabbard was another memory, this one capable of enhancing the weapon stored inside of it for a sufficient amount of time. Cassie, meanwhile, was back in her beautiful red peplos dress. Now, however, there were two bracelets on her hands instead of the golden shackles. One was a protective charm memory. The other was supposed to enhance the force of her attacks. She still carried the quiet dance in a scabbard. This one mundane, not enchanted, but mostly used the guiding light in battle, although the white staff wasn't a memory. It did a good job of debilitating her enemies and crushing them into pulp. Sunny wasn't sure that using a sacred relic to split skulls was appropriate, but he wasn't going to complain. The gods were dead. Anyway, as for himself, Sunny had earned another 500 shadow fragments on the way to Windflower, bringing him close to 2,500, half of the amount he needed to become a terror. His luck with memories, sadly, had been really bad. He had received a few, but none of them were good enough to add to his soul arsenal. They ended up being fed to his shadows. He hadn't woven a lot of new memories, either. In fact, Sunny hadn't done a lot of weaving in these past few weeks. Not because there had been no time, but rather because he was currently interested in something else. That something was giving him a lot of trouble, to the point where he often found himself dejected and stupefied. And yet, Sunny persisted with this new interest. During the battle in the flooded temple, he had observed Cassie's artificial echo in action, even though it didn't seem that powerful. That was only because their enemies that time had been of both a higher rank and a higher class than the blade mannequin. Sunny wouldn't have wanted to face that thing in battle as an awakened. The most impressive thing about it, though, was the very fact that it was artificial. After interrogating Cassie and Nephis on the topic, he had found out that the Forgemasters of Clan Valor were capable of creating not only memories but also echoes. Making one was an extremely long process, though, and one that demanded a lot of precious resources. So, there were actually very few artificial echoes in existence, all of them belonging to the most valued members of the clan. Nevertheless, Sunny couldn't help but wonder if he would be capable of weaving echoes one day. As well, so he had spent most of his free time studying the blade mannequin. It wasn't going well, for now, but Sunny wasn't disheartened. His attempts to learn the sorcery of names weren't bearing any results. Anyway, although his horizons were somewhat expanded, Being able to actually use this power seemed to be beyond him. If there was one consolation, it was that Cassie was having just as much trouble with it. Being talentless together was less of a bitter pill to swallow. Her mastery of runic sorcery, though, was slowly growing. In fact, there seemed to be a positive loop between the sorcery of names and the sorcery of runes. Both were founded on invoking the true names of things, after all, albeit in a different manner. So, Cassie and Nephis were able to help each other improve. As a result, the blind girl had indeed managed to restore some of the enchantments permeating the chain breaker, just as she had told them. The graceful vessel was now once again capable of flight. It just couldn't fly for too long, or too fast. The strain of supplying the ancient ship with essence was dire enough to drain even Neph's reserves in less than a minute. It would have to be enough to carry them to the island at the center of Windflower. Now, all they needed was to actually find it. As Sunny stared at the horizon and tried not to feel too anxious, a swift shadow glided across the deck of the chain breaker. Then, a black bird landed on the branch near him. Crow was back. Strangely, though, the echo seemed less grumpy than it had been recently. Instead, it looked excited. Sunny raised an eyebrow and asked what it was. The crow hopped a couple of times, then cawed while spreading its wings to call out Jet's name. Jumping down from the tree, Sunny landed noiselessly on the deck and dissolved into the shadows. A split second later, he appeared on the bow of the ship. Gazing tensely at the horizon, Saint, who was standing nearby with a bow in her hand, spared him an indifferent gaze. Her ruby eyes glowed silently, not betraying any hint of emotion.
If only I could be this calm all the time.
Sunny remained motionless for a few minutes, then sent mental messages to Cassie and Nephis. I think we are drawing close. Indeed, out there, far in the distance. The flowing surface of the great river had grown a little hazy, as if obscured by mist. Considering Crow's excitement, it had to be Wind Rose.
Hurricane winds, destructive currents, and suffocating mist. We'll see how terrible that place is exactly very soon.
A few moments later, Cassie joined him at the bow. Nephis remained at the stern, holding the steering oar, but she did respond through the link of the shroud of dusk. I see. Sunny sighed, then glanced at the blind girl. The soul shard crowning her wooden staff was glowing, its light pointing precisely at the distant haze, and he stated that there was no doubt left. Cassie slowly nodded. Yes, we have arrived. The branches of the sacred tree rustled as the chain breaker took a turn. Nephis moved the ship in a wide spiral, positioning it directly upstream of the approaching hazard. By the time she did, Sunny could already see wisps of mist flowing over the surface of the restless water. Time to get to work. Concentrating, he called upon the shadows. The three of them had long discussed how to tackle the titanic whirlpool. There wasn't much they had to do, really. The first obstacle they were going to face was the repelling wind. So, Sunny lowered the sails to diminish the repelling force. The ship would be carried into the vortex by the current, and once they approached close enough, Nephis would invoke the true name of the wind to lessen its fury. The second obstacle would be raging currents. Sunny's authority over water wasn't strong enough to calm them, but the chain breaker was sturdy enough to withstand the fury of the elements. It wasn't going to overturn. Either, all they needed was a skilled helmsman and something to guide them through the mist. Cassie was going to accomplish both tasks with a little help from the guiding light. She was quite skilled in controlling the chain breaker, more than any of them were, however. She wasn't going to be able to guide the flying ship through the last, and most dangerous, of obstacles. Once they were close enough to the island at the center of the vortex, but not deep enough into the whirlpool to be swallowed by it, the chain breaker had to lift into the air and reach the shore before its helmsman ran out of essence. Nephis was a terror, and possessed the lineage of the sun god as well, which, among other things, drastically strengthened her soul. Her reserve of essence was the largest among them, so it would be her task to take up the steering oars in those last moments. As the first wisps of gray mist touched the bow of the chain breaker, Sunny suppressed a shiver and looked into the approaching wall of fog with a dark expression. Mist, mist. Nothing good ever happened when there was mist around, here in the dream realm. It was always a herald of something dreadful approaching. We have prepared for this. Taking a deep breath, he glanced at Cassie and smiled.
Let's go find Effie and Jet, then.
Soon, the chain breaker was swallowed by the mist. The winds had grown stronger, making the folds of Sunny's nebulous mantle flutter. Feeling drops of water fall on his face, he sighed and looked at Cassie. She lingered for a moment, then rushed away to replace Nephis at the steering oar after Sunny urged her to go. Sunny was left alone on the bow, looking into the mist with a dark expression on his face. Both of them were still alive. They had to be. Sunny could only murmur their names, Effie and Jet, but how could they? The third nightmare wasn't easy to survive, and these two, they, of all people, would have found it impossible to cling to life while stranded for more than a year on an isolated island. Jet could only exist by killing living beings to replenish her constantly dwindling essence. After all, Effie was a slave to inhuman hunger, without access to a great amount of food. She would swiftly wither and die. How many foes to kill could there have been on a hidden island? And how much food? The crow echo still existed, which meant at least one of them was still. But Sunny tried not to think about that.
That crow has always been a bit strange, though much too animated for a simple echo. Perhaps it has something to do with Wake of Ruin, so who's to say that it can't exist without a master?
Sunny threw a dark glance at the Sin of Solace, who grinned in response.
Admit it, they're both probably dead already. How sad. They were slowly starving to death while you were having fun with Nephis on the Dark Island. You really took it easy back then. At the beginning, didn't you?
Sunny looked away and gritted his teeth. The sword wraith simply laughed.
Come to think of it, your friend Kai is most likely dead. Too. Even if the nightmare creatures didn't kill him, Mordred surely did. He's probably walking around now, wearing Kai's corpse right as a luxury brand suit. Well, it's for the best. You've always been jealous of that guy. Anyway, the insecure little wretch that you're.
The surface of the great river was growing restless. The waves were already much taller than before, making the bow of the chain breaker sway, feeling the deck rise and fall beneath him. Sunny closed his eyes for a moment.
That's not true. Kai has Anvil's charm. I gave it to him. Mordred can't possess someone wearing that charm.
The Sin of Solace stared at him for a few moments, a mocking smile on his lips.
The charm, right. It protected wealth really well.
Snarling, Sunny turned around and prepared to rebuke the apparition, but at that moment, a calm voice resounded from behind them.
Are you talking to your sword again?
He flinched and looked back. Neph's slender figure slowly revealed itself from the mist, two pristine white sparks burning in her cold gray eyes. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded silently, stopping once she reached him. Nephis looked into the mist and said, her voice even.
I believe that they're all alive, too.
A bitter smile appeared on Sunny's lips.
Sure, but it seems like wishful thinking, doesn't it?
People weren't immortal. He had lost enough comrades to know how ruthless this world they lived in was. So wasn't it a bit naive to stubbornly cling to hope after Antarctica? Nephis shook her head.
On the contrary, I think there's a valid and logical reason to believe that all members of the cohort aren't dead yet.
She put her hand on the hilt of her sword and said calmly,
The 6 plagues exist. They're most likely the future versions of the 6 of you. Therefore, none of you is likely to be dead in the present. Otherwise, their existence can't be explained.
Sunny hesitated for a moment, then nodded.
Strangely reassuring in a morbid kind of way. You can't die yet because you're destined to become a defiled monster. What a paradox.
Neph's logic assumed that the future was predetermined. If so, there was no way that Effie and Jet were gone. However, That also meant that there was no way for the 6 of them to avoid killing her and becoming the 6 plagues, which made this whole endeavor meaningless if the future wasn't predetermined. Though, then the cohort could potentially write a different ending for themselves and the nightmare. Yet it also meant that there was no reason to believe that the rest of the members were still alive. Sunny knew that fate could hardly be changed, but he also knew that it didn't govern every small occurrence and event. The details of what happened, and how it did, could be altered. It was just that the end result almost always remained the same. Sooner or later, all deviations were proven meaningless, failing to change the grand design of the future. It was easier to change fate inside of a nightmare, as well, due to its fragmented and isolated nature. Plus, the Great River was a strange place. Who was to say that their fate wasn't to become the 6 plagues, only for their younger selves to slay them and conquer the nightmare unscathed? He rubbed his face, complaining that his head hurt. All this stuff, the paradoxical nature of the Great River, the unreliable future, the greater tapestry of fate, were too strange and irrational for a human mind to comprehend. The best they could do was just try to do their best at the moment and strive to reach the desired outcome, ignoring the confusing reality of the tomb of Ariel as much as possible. The winds were growing stronger. The branches of the sacred tree swayed. Rustling worriedly, the swaying of the deck grew more pronounced. A thick mist enveloped everything in sight. He looked at Nephis, surprised by her strangely candid tone as she called out his name, and raised an eyebrow, knowing her. Some ridiculous statement was about to follow. He wasn't going to be fooled into listening to her apologize for his projector twice, but Nephis was perfectly earnest.
There's nothing wrong with a bit of wishful thinking. We will find them both alive. I am sure of it.
At that moment, the wind slammed into them like a ram, making both sway. Raising a hand, Sunny caught Nephis and helped her steady herself. At the same time, he used the feather of truth trait of the shell to increase his weight and ground himself more solidly on the deck. The two of them remained silent for a few moments, looking into each other's eyes. Then, Sunny smiled.
All right, Neph, I'll believe you this time.
Soon, they were deep into the barrier surrounding Wind Rose. There was nothing but blinding mist, hurricane winds, and violent currents in this dreadful and deadly place. Sunny could easily imagine countless ships being drowned by the inconceivable whirlpool, powerful nightmare creatures. As well, no wonder almost no one returned after being swallowed by the mist. And yet, the fury of the wind was terrible, but not terrible enough to sway them. Nephis had invoked the true name of the wind, lessening the pressure on the graceful ship. The chain breaker stubbornly cut through the mist, refusing to be pushed back. The violence of the raging currents was daunting, but not daunting enough to stop them, guided by Cassie's steady hand. The chain breaker broke through the fortress wall of the towering waves, never straying off course by then. The natural flow of the great river was replaced entirely by a terrifying tide that was pulling them deeper and deeper into the mist. The deck beneath their feet was tilted downward, indicating that they were sliding into the giant, insatiable maw of the colossal whirlpool, instead of allowing the ship to be carried by the current. Cassie kept its bow pointed perpendicular to the rush of seething water, cutting as short a line to the center of the vortex as possible. It took a lot of effort to keep the chain breaker under control, but she managed it splendidly. It was still too early to take to the sky. Sunny and Nephis had long joined Cassie at the stern. Fiend and Crow were hiding under the sacred tree, both soaked in water and miserable, while Nightmare had dissolved into shadows and hid in their dark embrace. Only Saint remained on the bow of the ship, standing there like an immovable onyx statue. The plume of her helmet danced in the wind. It was easy to get lost in the mist, but the radiance of the guiding light was showing them the way. Straining against the howling wind, Sunny yelled to ask how much longer it would take. His shout was swallowed by the mist. At almost the same time, though, the veil of fog was torn apart for a few brief moments. When Sunny saw the scale and magnitude of the vortex they were trying to brave, his face turned ashen. The whirlpool was indeed colossal, stretching as far as the eye could see. The raging tide moved in a vast circle, forming a revolving crater. They were currently sliding recklessly down its slope. Far away and below them, a harrowing darkness devoured the world. The depths of the great river lay naked and revealed, but his human eyes weren't capable of discerning what dwelled below. Or maybe there was nothing there at all, just an endless, bottomless abyss. However, there was an island hovering in the air above the darkness. Flowing mist shrouded its dark cliffs, and a magnificent tower rose from somewhere far inland, obscured by fog. The sight of the island was both austere and sinister, like a stark omen of ill fate. Cassie let go of the steering oar and stepped out of the circle, shouting for them to hurry as she allowed Nephis to take her place. Neph was there a split second later. She took both steering oars and looked ahead, white flames dancing in her eyes. Then, her radiant essence poured into the runic circle, flooding the enchantments of the ancient vessel with incinerating power. Sunny yelped and grabbed a railing. In the next moment, the chain breaker shook slightly and soared into the air. It's working. The graceful vessel wasn't flying nearly as fast as it had been able to before, and its flight wasn't nearly as smooth, but they were indeed in the air, moving toward the distant island. When Cassie and the fire keepers had restored the ancient flying ship to a shadow of its former glory, it had already been an incredible feat. But that had taken them almost a year, with dozens of people lending a hand. The fact that the blind girl now managed to achieve so much alone and in the span of a few weeks was truly remarkable, and it gave them the chance to accomplish their goal. Of course, it was still unclear if the chain breaker would be able to maintain its flight for long enough. Would they reach Windflower Island? Or would they plummet into the darkness and be crushed by the dreadful vortex? Sunny turned his head and looked at Nephis, who was holding the steering oars, her eyes shining with a brilliant white radiance. He muttered that there was only one way to find out. He could sense a flood of essence pouring out of her soul like a shining torrent. That essence was absorbed by the runic circle and flowed through the enchanted lines stretching throughout the ship, feeding its enchantments with power. There was no hint of doubt on Neph's face, and so he decided to throw away his doubts as well. A few moments later, the shroud of mist obscured everything once again. Only the glow of the guiding light was there to show them the way. The chain breaker sailed through the blinding fog, with only the rustle of countless leaves proving that the sacred tree still existed somewhere out there. Near them, hidden from sight, while Sunny urged it on. They didn't have to struggle against the current anymore, but the hurricane winds were still raging. They slammed into the hull of the ship with vicious force, trying to push it back, and Sunny cursed in frustration. Because of it, the speed of the chain breaker fell even more. Sunny had been counting the seconds. It had already been a full minute since the moment Nephis stepped into the circle, more than they had been able to fly in the tentative test the day before. The radiance of her eyes was dimming. And yet, suddenly, Nephis moved and smoothly raised one of the oars. At the same time, the chain breaker began to descend. Gradually, the fury of the winds was extinguished. The mist was still obscuring the world. But then, the ancient vessel finally fell onto soft, white sand. There was a violent crash, but the hull of the chain breaker withstood the impact. The runic circle fell dormant once again, and the enchantments lost all power. There was nothing but mist around them, and silence. They had reached Windflower. Sunny waited for a moment, then slowly straightened and looked around. The chain breaker was laying on white sand, tilted awkwardly. It had shattered the side of a black cliff and was now leaning on it, which prevented the ship from turning over. They had gotten lucky despite the blind landing. The fog was still there, obscuring the world, but it had become less thick. Sunny could make out the figure of Saint standing still on the bow of the beached vessel. as well as more cliffs rising high above them. It seemed that Nephis had guided the chain breaker to a small strip of sand at the very edge of the island. Changing Star herself was leaning heavily on the steering oars. Her face was paler than usual, and the white flames were gone from her eyes. She had completely exhausted her essence to carry the ship across the dark abyss. Sunny grimaced. It was very unfortunate to have one of them utterly drained of essence right now. No one knew what dangers were waiting for them on the misty shore. These first minutes could very well prove to be of vital importance. Not that there had been a choice. I am fine, noticing his gaze. Nephis forced out a faint smile and put a hand on the hilt of her sword.
I can still put up a fight.
Sunny nodded, having no doubt in her ability to do just that. Despite this weakened state, she was a seasoned slayer. Nevertheless, they had to be careful not to allow themselves to be wounded. It would be quite a while before Nephis could heal them again. Cassie used the guiding light to pick herself off the deck and shivered slightly as the mist caressed her skin. Her expression was troubled, noticing it. Sunny tensed as well and asked what was wrong. The blind girl had an intuition that was far superior to even his. It had saved their lives numerous times, so seeing her this nervous wasn't a good sight. She lingered for a while, then shook her head with a frown.
I am not sure. I just have a very ominous feeling. This place, Windflower, every part of me is screaming that we are in danger.
Come to think of it, he felt it too, an invisible, dark pressure emanating from all around them. All his instincts were telling him one thing, that there were dreadful predators somewhere close, much more dreadful than even he himself was. Sunny scowled. Aren't we always in danger? Despite saying those words nonchalantly, he summoned the sin of solace and called upon his shadows. Saint, Fiend, and Nightmare got closer, surrounding the three masters in a defensive formation. Nephis had walked to the edge of the deck and was now peering into the fog, her expression impassive. After a few moments of silence, she turned to Cassie and told her to do it. They had discussed what to do a long time ago. The first thing, unless they were attacked immediately after landing, was to make use of the guiding light. None of them really understood how the divine relic worked, but they had established that it could point them in the direction of not only Windflower, but also Effie, or at least, its tip lit up when the person holding the staff thought about her. However, it didn't react the same way to Jet. That fact had been a source of many dark thoughts for Sunny as Crow landed on his shoulder. Cassie gripped the wooden staff tighter. Then, she lingered for a moment. Sunny glanced at the guiding light, which was still pointing to somewhere deep in the mist, and raised an eyebrow as Cassie murmured that it was strange.
What of it seems to be working just fine?
The blind girl shook her head.
No, nothing. It's just that I haven't asked it to find Effie yet. The light should still be pointing to Windflower. I thought it would disappear once we reached it.
She concentrated for a moment, and then the radiance of the enchanted crystal changed subtly. It was still pointing deeper inland, but at a different angle. Sunny secretly let out a sigh of relief. He didn't know if the guiding light truly pointed to Effie, her lifeless body, or something else entirely. And yet, seeing it shine was a relief.
That gluttonous woman, she'd better be alive, or else I'll be very cross with her.
He scowled, then took a step forward and urged them to go. Jumping over the railing, he plummeted down and landed on the sand. A moment later, Nephis was by his side. Saint and Fiend landed with a bit more noise than the two of them. And lastly, Nightmare leaped from the deck of the ship, carrying Cassie on his back. The six of them remained motionless for a few moments, listening to the silence of Windflower. There were no sounds around them, no movement. Only the soft white sand and the black cliffs faintly visible in the fog. A piece of rock fell from the shattered crag and rolled down. The noise both dampened and made louder by the mist. It echoes, making them tense. Sunny took a deep breath. His vision was obstructed by the fog, and strangely enough, so was his shadow sense. It wasn't entirely gone, but the range was limited to about as far as he could see. Beyond that, The shadows felt vague and unreliable. He didn't like being that vulnerable at all. At least the fog itself didn't feel dangerous. It was a nuisance, sure, but far from being as senselessly terrifying as the mists of the hollow mountains. And Sonny cursed the situation. Frowning, Sonny took a step forward. As he did, a human figure suddenly revealed itself from the murky veil of the fog. He flinched tensed, ready to attack, but then froze, black eyes, porcelain skin. The sin of solace was looking at him mockingly.
What did I scare you? How tiresome.
It was the damned apparition. Sonny gritted his teeth and walked past the sword wraith, heading straight for the cliffs. At the same time, he sent 3 of his 5 shadows in different directions, ordering them to cautiously scout ahead, slow and steady, slow and steady. Effie and Jet had already been on this island for more than a year. They would have to wait for a few hours, or even days more, if Sonny, Nephis, and Cassie were too hasty and proceeded recklessly. They could very well die before finding the lost members of the cohort. He wasn't going to underestimate the perils of Wind Flower, but he was going to find his friends. No matter what, there can't be any mistakes. As Sonny's shadows climbed the cliffs, he and his companions cautiously advanced up the beach. Even the crow, who had been anxious and impatient to find its master all this time, seemed wary and subdued. The black bird was sitting on Sonny's shoulder, its feathers raised, and kept silent. The mist swirled silently around them. Saint and Fiend were in the rear, both ready to defend against an unexpected attack at any moment. Sonny and Nephis were in the middle. Cassie rode Nightmare at the front of the group, her back straight. The radiance of the guiding light that she held up illuminated the way. At some point, the shadow steed suddenly stopped. Sonny gripped the hilt of the Sin of Solace tighter and asked in a low voice what was wrong. Cassie remained motionless for a moment, then pointed the sacred staff down at the ground. When Sonny and Nephis approached, they immediately understood why. Out there in the white sand, hidden in the mist, was a line of lonesome footprints. Sonny kneeled to study them, a frown appearing on his face, and observed that they had been left by a human. Neff's voice echoed in the fog. He nodded slightly. Indeed, the shallow prints left in the sand belonged to a human. From the look of it, someone had walked across the beach, barefoot. It was hard to tell the gender of the person just from these traces, but they couldn't have been of a very large stature. Both the size and the depths of the footprints proved otherwise. The traces also looked fresh. They couldn't have been left more than a few hours ago. Sonny felt a cold chill creeping up his spine. Who was taking barefoot walks in this harrowing place? There was another strange detail about the footprints, contrary to what Sonny would have expected. The line of them came from the direction of the cliffs and disappeared in the mist, heading toward the edge of the island, and yet they hadn't met or heard anyone on their way here. He hesitated for a few moments, then looked at Nephis and told her to wait there, leaving one shadow behind to step out of it should the need arise. Sonny stood up and followed the footprints into the fog. Soon, his companions disappeared from view, and he was left alone in the swirling mist. I don't like it. If not for the fact that he could still see them through the shadow, Sonny would have been tempted to turn back. A few minutes later, he reached the end of the beach. The edge of the island opened into an abyssal chasm. The view of the colossal whirlpool and the darkness hiding below obscured by the fog. Sonny felt something he hadn't felt for a long time, a sense of vertigo.
Come now, really, I can turn into a bird. Is it really necessary to be afraid of heights?
He sighed and shook his head. The footprints led to the very end of the island. There, the lonesome line of them disappeared, as if the person who had left it behind leaped off the edge into the misty abyss. Sonny was suddenly overcome by a strange melancholy. He slowly looked at the Sin of Solace, who was standing at the very edge, looking into the fog with a distant expression, and Riley asked why the wraith didn't try jumping, too. No thanks, the sword wraith smiled.
Why not? You said it yourself. You can turn into a bird. Hey, maybe this person knew how to fly, too.
Sonny sighed and nodded.
I should watch the sky, well, watch the fog above. Aerial attacks are some of the most nasty.
As he was walking back to Nephis and Cassie, Sunny was thinking about the footprints in the sand, who had left them behind. Had that person really jumped off the edge? If so, why? Were they swallowed by the dark abyss? It seemed like such a shame. If the chain breaker arrived at Windflower a few hours earlier, they could have met this person. How bitter would it be to arrive at an island from where no one could return on the same day that its inhabitant had decided to take their own life? Maybe they hadn't, though. Maybe they really had soared into the sky and escaped this forlorn place. He couldn't be sure. One thing he was sure about, though, was that the footprints didn't belong to Effie or Jet. Effie was too tall to have left them behind, while Jet would have never chosen to end her life. After everything she had done to preserve it, she had literally climbed out of a grave and endured being dead, all to continue living. Would a person like that ever give up? Sunny had no doubt that she wouldn't. By the time he reunited with Nephis and Cassie, his shadows had already scaled the cliffs. In front of them was a dark forest of tall pine trees, mist swirling between the ancient trunks. One shadow cautiously glided to the left, another to the right, while the last one continued to advance forward in the direction of the distant tower. The island was large, much larger than the islands of the Chained Isles were. So exploring it was going to take a lot of time, especially because Sunny wanted to be careful and not expose his shadows to any danger.
It's going to take days and weeks, maybe, damn it.
There was no sign of Effie and Jet.
The footprints lead to the edge of the island. I didn't find anything else, so let's trace them in the other direction.
Cassie raised the guiding light again, and they moved along the line of footprints toward the cliffs. They advanced slowly and cautiously, never letting their guard down, although nothing had attacked them yet. The quiet feeling of danger was growing more dire and terrifying with each step. Eventually, they arrived in front of a vertical wall of black rock. The footprints disappeared once again, this time in front of narrow stairs cut into the cliffside. The steps led all the way to the forest. By the looks of it, Sunny and Nephis glanced at each other, seeing that the stone stairs were too narrow to maintain their formation. If something attacked them while they were ascending the steps, they would have to fight in a very awkward position. So Sunny ordered Fiend to take the lead. The Steel Ogre was the most resilient out of them, so he was going to serve as the shield of the cohort. The Shadow didn't seem too concerned with his task, either. With dark flames burning in his eyes, he moved to the front of the formation and stepped onto the first step. As they climbed the stairs, Sunny walked behind Nephis and noticed that she was paying a lot of attention to the stone steps disappearing beneath their feet. So he asked what she was thinking about. She hesitated for a few moments, then said evenly that they were man-made. Sunny nodded. After a short pause, Neph added,
Which means that they must have been cut from stone by the Seeker who lived on this island.
It was a logical conclusion. Sunny glanced at the stone steps, thinking about how ancient they were. Then he scowled and asked whether she had noticed it, too. Sunny lingered for a moment, then answered Neph's question with another nod. These stairs were strange. They were supposed to be ancient, and yet there was no sign of corrosion on them. The steps weren't weathered and ground down by the endless assault of the elements. Instead, they were perfectly preserved and sharp, as if someone had cut them just yesterday.
Is this rock indestructible, or are there strange things happening to time on this island?
Sunny wanted to examine this question further, but at that moment, he froze. Out there, far ahead, the shadow he had sent toward the tower heard a sound, although it was muffled by the mist. Sunny would never fail to recognize it. It was the sound of steel clashing against steel, followed by a scream of pain. At the same moment, the crow that had been sitting silently on his shoulder suddenly jumped into the air and shot forward, instantly disappearing into the fog. Sunny's eyes widened as he shouted Jet's name. Sunny had recognized the voice. There was no doubt that the person screaming in pain in the depths of the forest was Jet. She was so close and in danger. He hesitated for a moment, Bad, bad. His intuition was telling him that something absolutely deadly waited for him in the mist. Blindly rushing forward could very well invite disaster. And more than that, the scream itself was suspicious. Was Soul Reaper Jet someone to scream from pain? No, she wasn't. Sunny had seen her maintain composure while impaled on a jagged piece of alloy. Something could have been mimicking her voice to lure them into a trap. He had met creatures that lived in the mist and mimicked human voices before. After all, the memory alone was enough to make him shudder. And yet, what if it really was her? If there was something on the island that had made Jet shriek in agony, then the danger she faced was truly dire. There was no time to hesitate at all. He flinched, then looked at Nephis severely. Despite Sunny's shaken state, he knew that he had already made the decision. His voice was steady when he spoke, ignoring her questioning call of his name to deliver his report.
Someone is fighting in the forest, about 4 kilometers from the top of the stairs. It should be Jet. I am going.
She looked at him for a moment, then nodded calmly and unsheathed her sword. We'll be right behind you. Then, as Cassie commanded the guiding light to point its radiance to where Sunny was instead of Effie, he dove into the shadows. I am doing something very dangerous. Throughout the years, Sunny had often been forced to take unacceptable risks, but that was only because his back had been against the wall and the circumstances hadn't allowed him to make a different choice. If possible, he preferred to win every battle before it even started, or at least get as close to ensuring the favorable result as possible, observing his enemy, making careful preparations, dictating the ebb and flow of the battle. That was where he felt the most comfortable. And where his aspect truly shined, right now, Sunny had no idea what enemy he was going to face, was rushing into battle without having made any preparations, and didn't hold any initiative at all. Much worse, he was doing all these things here, in the depths of the third nightmare, surrounded by the mists of wind flower. It was hard to imagine a place more perilous than that.
It's just one of those situations where I only have bad choices. It's going to be all right, though I've survived all the previous gambles, so I'll pull through this time as well.
Stepping out of the shadow that had heard Jet's voice, Sunny gave it an order to wrap itself around him and dashed into the mist with as much speed as he could muster. At the same time, he called the other 2 scouting shadows back. It was going to take a bit of time for them to return, but still, he preferred to plan ahead, tearing through the fog. Sunny swiftly traversed the remaining distance to the place where the scream had come from. Soon, he broke free of the pine trees and entered a wide clearing. The ever-present fog was a bit thinner here, allowing him to see a dozen meters or so in all directions. Sunny dug his heels into the soft moss and slid for a few meters before coming to a halt. The sin of solace was already raised, ready to strike, but there was no movement around him. Sunny froze for a split second, scanning the misty clearing. He didn't see or sense any enemies, at least not in the small area he could perceive. But he sensed the familiar smell of blood and shouted that he had found her, out there in front of him, hidden by fog. A figure was slumped on the ground, dashing forward. Sunny approached the figure and staggered, cursing under his breath. It was indeed Jet. However, she was. Her black leather armor seemed unbroken, and yet Soul Reaper's beautiful face was contorted in a grimace of pure agony. A moment later, Sunny noticed a strange incongruity about her. Looking closer, he understood that Jet's right arm was laying a bit too far from her body. It had been viciously severed near the shoulder. The hand was still clutched into a fist, but the glaive gripped and it was broken, already dissipating into a stream of white sparks. The moss was greedily absorbing dark, steaming blood. His chest suddenly felt constricted.
Neph hasn't recovered her essence yet.
As he thought that, Jet suddenly opened her eyes. They had always been icy and blue, but now the blue color had become so intense that it almost seemed as if it was glowing in the dim twilight of the misty island. There was a hint of recognition in her dazed gaze. Her lips moved. But Sunny failed to discern the barely audible whisper, so he pleaded with her to hold on, kneeling in front of her. He lowered his head and listened. Jet's voice was weak and hoarse as she warned him that something was behind him in the fog. His eyes widened. A split second later, he was already moving, jumping to his feet. Sunny spun and brandished the sin of solace. He only had enough time to notice a vague shape in the swirling mist, elusive and ethereal, as if made out of the fog itself. The world around him was suddenly terribly cold, the breath escaping from his mouth as steam. Got you. The jade blade of the cursed giant sliced through the ethereal figure without meeting any resistance. Sunny was used to the feeling of the flesh of his enemies parting before the white jade like water, so he wasn't too surprised. However, something was wrong. Cursing, he jumped back, narrowly avoiding being grasped by the misty apparition. Cold sweat appeared on his face. Sunny had no reason to believe so, but he felt as if he had just avoided certain death and voiced his confusion. His thoughts were moving quickly. The sin of solace had passed through the enemy, but the enemy easily shrugged off the attack. How could it be?
Elusive, ethereal, seemingly woven out of fog, an incorporeal enemy.
This wasn't the first time he had faced murderous wraiths and ghost-like abominations. Grimacing, Sunny let go of the hilt of his cursed sword and allowed it to fall to the ground. Luckily, he had a weapon perfectly capable of destroying intangible foes. The ghost blade enchantment of the cruel sight allowed it to do just that. Now, he just had to survive a few seconds until the somber spear manifested itself. The problem was that he couldn't see the mist wraith anymore. After attacking once, it dissolved into the swirling fog, becoming utterly invisible. The next strike could come at any moment, from any direction. The gloomy and happy shadows were already approaching from two different directions. Very soon, they would reach the clearing and augment his speed even more. This battle wasn't going to be as hard then, and Sunny muttered that he just needed to hold on a moment longer. Jet's hoarse voice resounded from below, weakly calling his name, but he didn't allow himself to look down. All his focus was concentrated on the swirling mist, watching for the signs of the next attack. Be careful, she's. Finally, the cruel sight appeared in his hand, instantly igniting with the radiance of divine flame. The fog around the silver blade seethed, evaporating at almost the same time. The happy shadow reached the clearing and burst from the line of trees, flying toward him with incredible speed. The gloomy shadow wasn't far behind. The mist moved. Strangely enough, the wraith wasn't lunging at him. Instead, it was at the edge of the clearing, moving to intercept. No. Suddenly, harrowing pain tore through Sunny's mind and body. Letting out a bestial wail, he fell to one knee, clutching at his chest. It was an agony unlike anything he had ever experienced. As Sunny watched with disbelieving eyes, his vision blurry, the happy shadow was out there, in front of him, impaled on a ghostly blade. Once lively and joyful, it was now empty and hollow, dead. The spell whispered solemnly into his ear, "Your shadow has been destroyed. Your shadow core has been destroyed." Gloomy. Sunny was paralyzed by pain, but he tried to move nevertheless. However, it was too late. The mist wraith was suddenly on the opposite side of the clearing, and he was brought to the ground by another wave of unimaginable, killing torment. Your shadow has your core destroyed. His soul was severely damaged. Two of his shadow cores had shattered, and his soul was falling apart. No, no, no. Letting out a tortured howl, Sunny struggled to stand up, but all he managed was to rise to one knee. It was then that he felt a cold presence looming above him. Looking up, he saw it. Two icy blue eyes, looking down at him with inhuman coldness, laying on the ground. Jet whispered in a voice that was like a dying flame that the enemy was her. Then, a ghostly blade pierced Sunny's chest. It passed through the dark fabric of Anank's mantle and the black silk of the Shroud of Dusk as if they were no obstacles at all. Neither marble shell nor bone weave offered it any resistance. Either, the blade didn't cut Sunny's skin. Not did it sever his flesh. Instead, it struck directly at his lightless soul, already damaged. It crumbled from that single strike. That was how Sunny had been slain by undying slaughter of the 6 plagues for the first time. Sunny waited for a moment, then slowly straightened and looked around. The chain breaker was laying on white sand, tilted awkwardly. It had shattered the side of a black cliff and was now leaning on it, preventing the ship from turning over. They had gotten lucky despite the blind landing. The fog was still there, obscuring the world, but it had become less thick. Sunny could make out the figure of Saint standing still on the bow of the grounded vessel, as well as more cliffs rising high above them. It seemed that Nephis had guided the chain breaker to a small sand beach at the very edge of the island. Neph herself was leaning heavily on the steering oars. Drained of essence, Sunny grimaced.
It was inevitable, but we should be careful not to receive any serious wounds. She won't be able to heal us anytime soon.
Nephis, meanwhile, had already regained her composure.
I am fine. I can still put up a fight.
Well, of course you can. I have no doubt about that.
After exchanging a few words with them, Cassie used the guiding light to make it point in the direction where Effie supposedly was.
Or her lifeless body, or something else entirely.
Sunny couldn't suppress his anxiety anymore. He scowled and took a step forward, ready to leap down to the beach.
That gluttonous woman, she'd better be alive, or else I'll be very cross with her.
Jumping over the railing, he plummeted down and landed on the sand. A moment later, Nephis was by his side. Saint and Fiend landed with a bit more noise than the two of them. And lastly, Nightmare leaped from the deck of the ship, carrying Cassie on his back. The 6 of them remained motionless for a few moments, listening to the silence of Windflower. There were no sounds around them, no movement. Only the soft white sand and the black cliffs faintly visible in the fog. A piece of rock fell from the shattered crag and rolled down. The noise both dampened and made louder by the mist. It echoes, making them tense, feeling very uncomfortable because of how suppressed both his vision and shadow sense were. Sunny took a step forward. As he did, a human figure suddenly revealed itself from the murky veil of the fog. He flinched and tensed, ready to attack, but then froze, black eyes, porcelain skin. The sin of Solace looked at him contemptuously and spat.
Gods, this again. I am so sick of it.
Sunny gritted his teeth and walked past the damned sword wraith. But then he lingered for a moment. Suddenly, a strange sense of déjà vu overcame him. Why did he feel as if the sin of Solace was supposed to say something else? Shaking his head, Sunny ignored the loathsome apparition and headed straight for the cliffs. Less than an hour later, he was writhing on the ground, overwhelmed by unbearable agony. His lightless soul was mutilated and slowly falling apart. As Sunny arduously rose to one knee, a cold gaze pierced him from above. No, no, no. Then a ghostly blade pierced his chest. Sunny died. Sunny waited for a moment, then slowly straightened and looked around. The chain breaker was laying on white sand, tilted awkwardly. Nephis was leaning heavily on the steering oars, utterly drained of essence.
We should be careful not to get wounded until she recovers some essence.
She straightened slowly and said in a tired voice,
I am fine. I can still put up a fight.
Well, of course you can. You're changing star of the immortal Flame Clan.
They exchanged a few words with Cassie, who then used the guiding light to point them in the direction where Effie was supposed to be. Soon, Sunny jumped down to the beach, followed by the rest of his companions.
That gluttonous woman, she'd better be alive, or else I'll be very cross with her.
Feeling vulnerable in the swirling mist, he scowled and took a step forward. As he did, a human figure suddenly revealed itself from the murky veil of the fog. Sunny flinched and tensed, ready to attack, but then froze, black eyes, porcelain skin. The sin of Solace was glaring at him without even trying to conceal his hatred.
You're such a pathetic, odious, revolting coward. Just die already, die. Gods, this is unbearable.
Sunny gritted his teeth and walked past the damned sword wraith, heading for the cliffs. He was suddenly overcome by a strange sense of déjà vu. Weird, what did that bastard say? Banishing the thought of the damnable sword wraith from his head, he continued forward. Soon after, a ghostly blade pierced his chest. Sunny died in agony. Sunny waited for a moment, then slowly straightened and looked around. The chain breaker was laying on white sand, tilted awkwardly. Nephis was leaning heavily on the steering oars, utterly drained of essence. A minute or two later, he jumped down to the beach and headed to the cliffs. As he did, a pale apparition suddenly appeared from the mist, scaring him. The sin of solace laughed.
Damn, it was fun at the start. But now I've already lost count.
Ignoring the odious wraith, Sunny continued walking. He was suddenly overwhelmed by a strange sense of déjà vu but dismissed it. Not long after that, his soul was destroyed by the ruthless blade of Undying Slaughter. He died in agony, he died in agony, he died in agony, he died. After Cassie used the guiding light to point them in the direction where Effie was supposed to be, Sunny jumped down to the beach and headed toward the cliffs. As he did, a pale apparition appeared from the mist and scared him, and Sunny wondered what was wrong with the bastard. The sin of solace glared at him silently, not saying anything, ignoring the loathsome wraith. Sunny walked past and advanced cautiously through the fog. A strange sense of déjà vu suddenly overwhelmed him, but he dismissed it, slow and steady, slow and steady. However, something was still gnawing on his mind. Scowling, Sunny stopped, lingered for a few moments, and turned around.
Hey, weren't you going to say something?
Nephis looked at him with a hint of surprise and asked whether he was talking to his sword. Sunny nodded and continued staring at the sin of solace, who silently glared at him back, while he wondered why he felt so strange. He remained motionless for a while, his expression growing darker. Eventually, Sunny uttered a curse and shook his head.
Hold on, I think something isn't right.
Because of Sunny, they spent more time near the chain breaker than they had planned. However, he simply couldn't tell what it was that had made him feel so uncomfortable. After a while, there was no choice but to head for the cliffs. Cassie rode Nightmare at the front of the group. Sunny and Nephis followed, while Saint and Fiend were defending the rear. As they walked, Sunny remained silent, a deep frown on his face, and admitted that he just felt strange. It was as if he had taken these steps before. The white sand, the swirling mist, the black edifices of the tall cliffs. It all felt eerily familiar, and he asked what was going on. Eventually, they discovered a line of footprints in the sand. Sunny should have felt surprised and curious, but he barely paid the mysterious discovery any attention, noting as if it was only natural for the footprints to be there, and observed that they had been left by a human. He shivered slightly and looked at Nephis. How had he known that she would say these exact words? Sunny hesitated for a few moments, then told them quietly to wait there. Why did he feel almost obligated to respond that way? Deeply disturbed, Sunny left one of his shadows behind and followed the line of footprints to the edge of the island. There were so many questions he should have been asking himself, like who had left these traces? Had that person really jumped into the abyssal chasm, or had they survived and escaped the suffocating mist? But instead, Sunny was mostly thinking about why it felt as if he had already visited the edge of the island before. The sin of solace was there, as well, glaring at him silently.
Why is he not saying anything? I feel like he should have said something already, like encourage me to jump too.
Scowling, Sunny returned to Nephis and Cassie.
The footprints lead to the edge of the island. I didn't find anything else, so let's trace them in the other direction.
When they nodded and prepared to set out, he suddenly added,
Don't you feel that something is strange?
Nephis looked at him with her usual impassive expression and remarked that everything here was strange. Sunny had no choice but to agree. It was a stupid question. To begin with, of course. Everything felt strange on a mystical island hidden behind a barrier of a colossal whirlpool. They continued forward and eventually reached stone steps leading up the hills. Fiend took the lead, and the group cautiously started the ascent. As they walked, Sunny couldn't shake off the feeling that these steps looked eerily familiar.
Just what the hell is going on with me? Am I under some kind of mind hex again?
By now, Sunny's resistance to mental attack was rather high. Even the sin of solace, a transcendent memory of the fifth tier, was having trouble driving him truly and utterly insane. He didn't doubt that there were beings in the tomb of Ariel that could shatter his defenses, but he did doubt that there was something here that could do so without him noticing, and asked what it was then. Looking up, he noticed that Nephis was staring intently at the stone steps.
She must have noticed that they aren't weathered at all, as if the seeker who had lived on the island created them just yesterday.
Wait, when had he come to these conclusions himself? It just seemed so obvious, as Sunny froze, feeling very confused. One of the scouting shadows suddenly heard the sound of steel clashing against steel, followed by a pained scream. He didn't feel surprised at all, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, and wondered if that was Jet's voice. The black crow that had been sitting on his shoulder suddenly dashed into the fog. Why did thinking about Jet fill him with a cold sense of dread? Cassie and Nephis had noticed his dazed state and called his name. He lingered for a moment.
Someone is fighting in the forest, about 4 kilometers from the top of the stairs. It should be Jet. I am going.
The words left his mouth as if he had rehearsed them. Nephis nodded, and he started to say they would be right behind her, without listening to her response. Sunny dove into the shadows. Something is wrong, something is wrong. He knew that he was taking a dire risk by rushing blindly into the forest. Windflower was too dangerous of a place to behave rashly. Sunny had no idea what enemy he was going to face, was diving into battle without having made any preparations, and didn't hold any initiative at all. But Jet was going to die if he delayed even for a moment. Somehow, he was sure of it, stepping out of the shadow deep within the forest. Sunny gritted his teeth and dashed forward.
It's just one of those situations where I only have bad choices. It's going to be all right, though I've survived all the previous gambles, so I'll pull through this time as well.
But then, he felt a chilling terror grasp his heart. Would he really pull through? Or would he die miserable after finally losing a gamble? Bursting onto a wide clearing, Sunny slid on the moss and came to halt close to its middle. The smell of blood permeated the air here, both frightening and familiar. Where is she? Where is she? Looking around, he noticed someone laying on the ground, their motionless figure buried in the mist, dashing there. Sunny fell to his knees and stared down with wide eyes. Jet, it was Jet. Her black leather armor seemed unbroken, but her beautiful face was contorted in a grimace of terrible agony. The moss was greedily drinking blood that flowed from the terrible wound where her arm had been viciously severed. Curse it all. Sensing his presence, Jet slowly opened her eyes and weakly tried to speak his name. Before Jet finished her warning to watch behind her in the fog, he was already jumping to his feet and spinning around. The sin of solace hissed, slicing the figure apart, and Sunny muttered that it wouldn't do anything. Why did he think that? Right, seemingly woven out of mist, ethereal, elusive. It had to be a wraith of some kind, meaning that physical attacks would be ineffective against it. It seemed that Sunny's subconscious had discerned the insidious nature of the enemy faster than his conscious mind did for this battle. He had to discard the jade giant and summon the cruel sight instead. A split second later, the mist wraith seemed to dissipate into the swirling fog. Sunny couldn't sense its presence at all. which meant that the abomination could attack at any moment, from any direction. Letting go of the sin of solace, he called upon the somber spear. Feeling as though he were missing something crucial, Sunny froze in place, torn between the dire need to be absolutely focused and the gnawing feeling that he was forgetting something terribly, terribly important, and he asked himself what it was. He couldn't allow himself to get distracted. A moment of inattention could mean death. So he shouted at himself to focus. His other two scouting shadows, gloomy and happy, were going to reach the clearing in a few seconds. Only when his body was augmented by all 5 shadows would he have the luxury of sparing some thought to the gnawing feeling. Jet's hoarse voice resounded from below, faltering and weak as she warned him to be careful of her. He looked down, and then Sunny was suddenly inexplicably calm. His lips moved as he realized she was him. The cruel sight finally manifested itself into existence. The happy shadow flew into the clearing. The mist wraith, Undying Slaughter, was already there, waiting for it. A terrible agony tore Sunny's soul apart, falling to his knees. He heard the spell whispers and thought that his shadow had been destroyed. Your shadow has been destroyed.
Sunny thought that his shadow core had been destroyed. Your shadow core has been destroyed. Sunny turned his thoughts to gloomy.
Another flash of indescribable torment pierced his existence. Throwing Sunny to the ground, writhing in pain, he struggled to stand up.
I knew this would happen. How did I know?
Finally, he managed to rise to one knee. The mist was suddenly unbearably cold, casing his body to shiver. Sunny raised his head and saw 2 icy blue eyes looking down at him. I am going to die now. The ghostly blade pierced his chest. Sunny waited for a moment, then slowly straightened and looked around. The chain breaker was laying on white sand, tilted awkwardly. The forest clearing was gone. The bleeding, broken figure of Jet was gone. The corpses of his shadows were gone, too, but he remembered it all clearly. The misty shore, the black cliffs, the cold twilight of the pine forest, the dread of dying on his knees. He remembered dying, but he hadn't. Otherwise, how would he be standing here on the deck of the chain breaker? Neph and Cassie must have saved me, somehow, and retreated back to the ship. It was at that moment that he heard Neph's voice.
I am fine. I can still put up a fight.
Sunny flinched and stared at her with a deadpan expression. Asking what she had just said, she raised an eyebrow and repeated that she could still fight. Sunny continued to stare at her silently. His mind was utterly empty.
These are the exact words she said when we first landed on the island. No, not just her words. Everything is exactly the same.
He looked around again, noting every small detail of their surroundings. He was right. It was as if the last hour had never happened, as if Sunny had returned to the past. He slowly raised a hand and ran it across his face. What the hell is going on?
It's exactly the same.
The chain breaker was leaning on a broken cliff, the mist swirling around it. Saint was standing motionlessly at the bow of the ship. Nephis had just stated that she would still be able to fight despite exhausting all her essence. Sunny looked at her, then shifted slightly and threw a glance at Cassie.
The last time I noticed her troubled expression and asked if there was something wrong, she explained how her instincts were screaming of danger.
He hesitated for a few moments and kept silent. Nephis, however, didn't, noting that Cassie seemed concerned about something. She asked evenly whether she had sensed something. The blind girl shook her head with a frown.
Nothing specific. I just have a very ominous feeling. This place, wind, flower, every part of me is screaming that we are in danger.
Sunny's eyes widened slightly. The wording had changed a little, but it was almost exactly the same response. And Sunny wondered how that could be, while Nephis and Cassie went about locating the direction where Effie supposedly was with the help of the guiding light. He observed them without saying anything. His mind was strangely split between 2 extremes. One part of it had turned cold and analytical, driven into a heightened state of utmost vigilance. The other, The other was shaken and distraught, still reeling from the agony of dying to the ghostly blade. The shock of remembering his harrowing demise was so visceral that Sonny wanted nothing more than to topple to the deck and curl into a shivering ball. Perhaps he had only managed to remain standing because he was frozen stiff.
Sonny, let's go if you don't mind.
He flinched and glanced at Nephis. She was already leaping over the railing, still slow to react. Sonny watched as Cassie awkwardly climbed on top of Nightmare and settled in the saddle. With her small stature, it wasn't that easy to accomplish, and Sonny murmured that he should adjust the stirrups. That ordinary thought finally broke his dazed state, commanding his shadows to disembark. He walked over to the edge of the deck and jumped down. He was the last one to set foot on the white sand of the misty beach.
I really seem to have traveled to the past, or is it an illusion? Then again, that vision of death might have been an illusion instead. A vision? Did I receive a prophetic vision meant for Cassie somehow?
His mind was in turmoil, which was why Sonny flinched and took a step back when a human figure suddenly revealed itself from the fog. He had completely forgotten about the sin of solace.
Right, that bastard scared me the last time too. Now he's going to glare at me silently.
The sin of solace did, indeed, glared at him silently for a moment, but then, the apparition smirked and said in a contemptuous tone,
You know, I am actually starting to enjoy this. Let's go for another round, shall we?
Sonny looked at him in surprise, apart from minute changes that had happened because of his inaction. This was the first thing that went differently than how it had in the previous round. A slight frown appeared on Sonny's face.
Why is the bastard the only exception to the rule?
Walking past the apparition, he said quietly that sure, they would go for another round. The wraith stared at him in surprise. As they advanced through the mist, discovered the line of footsteps in the sand, and continued toward the cliffs. Sonny was thinking feverishly.
Is it an illusion, or have I really traveled in time? If it's the latter, then why? And what do I do now that I have?
There was too much to think about and not enough time. His mental state was in shambles. As well, Sonny vaguely realized that he was still in shock, but didn't know what to do about it. He was probably missing a lot of vital things in this rattled condition. For example, suddenly, Sonny felt incredibly cold.
How have I not thought about that?
They were already ascending the stone steps, which meant that Jet was going to be attacked by Undying Slaughter in a matter of minutes, seconds. Curse it. His mind ignited, thinking as fast and best as he could. Sonny cursed himself for being such a fool. He wasted almost an entire hour trying to understand why he had been sent into the past instead of considering how to deal with the future. Even if he was in shock after having his soul torn apart and dying in agony, there was no excuse, and he demanded to know what he should do now. He remembered his naive thoughts bitterly. He would pull through again, somehow. It was just another gamble.
It seems I have finally become arrogant.
And paid a heavy price for it, the heaviest price there could be.
Doesn't matter, there's no time to feel regret. I need to decide what to do now.
A small, cowardly part of him instantly had an answer. The safest thing to do was to abandon Jet and save himself from having to face Undying Slaughter. He knew that he would die in that clearing, so why go there at all? But even knowing the danger, he couldn't let Jet die. It wasn't such a foolish thought to go there and fight.
I still don't know enough about Undying Slaughter.
Fighting her now would be unwise, but he didn't really need to. All he had to do was grab Jet and run. At that point, the shadow he had sent to scout ahead finally heard it, the sound of clashing steel, followed by Soul Reaper's pained scream. Sonny gritted his teeth and urged them on. Dismissing the sin of solace, Sonny called upon the cruel sight and looked at Nephis. There was no time to explain everything, But he still had to warn them in advance. What to say? How would he even explain a situation like that? Not finding any good words, Sunny just said what came to mind.
I found Jet. She's being attacked by a powerful enemy, a wraith-like creature capable of dealing damage directly to our souls. I'll try to get Jet and retreat, prepare for battle.
Before she had time to respond, Sunny already dove into the shadows.
The reason I died was because I lost the initiative by not knowing the nature of the enemy and not having the correct weapon to deal with a wraith immediately at hand. Most importantly, I failed to realize that my shadows would be vulnerable to Undying Slaughter's attacks as well.
He had dodged the first attack of the Defiled without too much trouble. It was unknown which one of them would have lost in the end after the cruel sight had manifested itself. In a normal fight, however, Undying Slaughter had moved to destroy his shadows first. It was no surprise that she had known just how to kill him in one fell swoop. After all, the Mist Wraith was most likely a defiled version of Soul Reaper Jet using her future transformation ability. Jet knew a lot about his aspect, and the future Jet would have known even more. That had been Sunny's undoing. After a vast part of his soul had been destroyed, he was in no condition to put up any further resistance, so he died miserably on his knees. This time was going to be different. First, he had already summoned the cruel sight. Second, he would protect his shadows. And lastly, he knew a lot about Jet's aspect, as well, stepping out of the shadow. He wrapped it around his body and dashed toward the clearing.
The dormant ability allows her to absorb the essence of living beings she kills. The awakened ability allows her to strike directly at the souls of her enemies, bypassing all forms of physical defense. The ascended ability allows her to increase the size and capacity of her shattered soul core, as well as removing the limit on how much essence she can use to enhance her body.
Sunny didn't know how ancient Undying Slaughter really was. How distant was the future she had come from. However, her Frankenstein's monster of a soul core would have already reached an enormous size. Considering how many people the 6 plagues had slaughtered, she was powerful. He also didn't know much about her transcendent ability. It was most likely how Undying Slaughter had attacked him in the form of a wraith, but the details of her transformation were unclear.
I should be able to get through this as long as I am careful.
Or not, bursting from the line of trees, Sunny ignited the silver blade of the cruel sight with divine flames and dashed toward where Jet was laying on the ground, her blood pouring into the moss. As he kneeled in front of her, tense and ready to fight, she opened her icy blue eyes and looked at him weakly. Her lips moved, telling him not to speak because she knew Sunny didn't have to kneel and show his back to the enemy. However, if he had the opportunity to fool Undying Slaughter into thinking that she had the upper hand, it would be criminal not to use it. Sensing an almost imperceptible disturbance in the mist and knowing it was time, he shot to his feet and lashed out with the radiant blade of the cruel sight. There was a vague figure hidden in the fog, already moving to attack him, caught by surprise. It had no chance to avoid the sudden strike. And yet, it did. Sunny pulled back his spear and froze, tensely observing the mist, despite the fact that their roles had reversed, and he was the one to deliver an unexpected attack. The end result was the same. Undying Slaughter had dissipated into the fog, and he was left not knowing where the next blow would come from, surprised by how fast the wraith was. Or he would have, if not for the fact that he knew the future. Wrong. Sunny knew what would have happened, not what would happen. Him changing the opening exchange of the battle could have changed what Undying Slaughter would do. As well, he still had to be careful. However, the next few seconds went just as they had before. The Mist Wraith didn't attack him again, hiding and waiting, until the happy shadow flew from behind the trees and rushed toward its master. Sunny remembered the harrowing agony of having his soul torn apart and felt his hair stand on end. The mist swirled, and the wraith hiding within it moved to intercept the swift shadow. Even knowing what was about to come, he couldn't suppress his fear and cursed. Undying Slaughter brought its ghostly blade down, but before it could plunge into the shadow, it was met by another blade, this one made of pure darkness. as two ruby flames ignited in the depths of his shadow. Saint deflected the wraith's blow and stepped into the clearing.
Blade of Darkness ability description. The true darkness dwelling in the shadow's heart can be summoned in the form of a fearsome weapon. As long as the shadow has mastered the use of that weapon, the Blade of Darkness can slay those of flesh and those of spirit. It never dulls, never falters, and never breaks. Alternatively, the darkness can be summoned to augment a mundane weapon.
Saint's dark sword could cut both tangible and intangible enemies. Just like the cruel sight could, more than that, she was immune to soul damage, which made his taciturn shadow an almost perfect adversary for the hateful mist wraith. Even if Undying Slaughter was a defiled transcendent like the Mad Prince was, Saint was a transcendent devil. Their power, at least theoretically, was on par, or so Sunny hoped, faced with the dark blade. The mist wraith glided back. The next moment, a second shadow appeared in the clearing. Fiend jumped out of it, infernal flames burning in his eyes. The happy shadow wrapped itself around the graceful stone knight, while the gloomy one wrapped itself around the steel ogre. Sunny himself was augmented by the other three. Undying Slaughter was caught in the middle of a triangle formed by Saint, Fiend, and Sunny. And Sunny challenged her to see who would die now, forcing himself to grin. Sunny gripped the cruel sight tighter and dashed forward.